Plants of Power, a 6-part radio series about mind-altering drugs in nature and culture. Written and presented by Nick Rankin. Plants of Power. Program 1. Brain Power.
Hello. People and plants go back a long way together, and this series is about our chemical connection, a story of dangers and delights. Plants make chemicals to protect themselves. Some of them are poisons, and we people need chemicals to live. The human brain works on chemicals. Your moods, thoughts and feelings are governed by drugs manufactured naturally in your body. This series argues that drugs are part of our nature, common to all human cultures. Plants of Power trace our secret history and help to reveal our inner selves.
Plants produce phenomenally complex compounds that are probably to do with attracting or repelling other life forms. By chance, those products have equally remarkable effects on the human nervous system and the brain, which is the most complex organ in the known universe. Plants are unimaginably powerful. I'm Dr. Clive Cohen. I'm from King's College London. I work in the Biomedical Sciences department, and my main interest is in neuroscience.
Neuroscience is the science of the brain.
Science of the brain and the spinal cord and the peripheral nervous system.
Now, the brain is sort of wetware sloshing around in our skull. It is chemical. It's a chemical system, isn't it?
It's an immensely complicated universe of cells that are speaking to each other and somehow promoting vast numbers of functions, many of which have nothing to do with thinking. The man in the street may think that the brain is largely to do with emotions and thinking. It's certainly subserving those functions, but it's maintaining temperature regulation, water balance, reproductive hormones, biological rhythms, countless hosts of functions.
And at this moment, at the end of the 20th century, we don't fully understand the full potential of the brain.
We understand practically nothing, to be honest. We know quite a lot of the phenomena, and they're being studied with great diligence and great accuracy, but it's a science still in its infancy. It's really only a few decades old.
Any drug or agent that affects your mental state must get through to your brain. Now, your brain works by electricity and chemistry. The chemicals in your brain that signal to each other are called neurotransmitters, and they lock onto the receptors of other cells to do their business. David Pierce runs BLTC Research. That stands for Better Living Through Chemistry, and he wants to make people happier by modifying the brain balance.
Basically, the mind-brain is a community of perhaps thousands of millions of nerve cells, and somehow they have to talk to each other because for the most part they're not directly connected, and they do so by these little chemicals, and the terminals for from one cell release these chemicals, and these chemicals lock on to receptors, which is rather like locks and keys, on let's say a nearby cell, and this triggers off a whole cascade of events inside the cell. And by changing the way our cells talk to each other, it's possible to alter mood, it's possible to alter thought. It can be done in an uncontrolled and dangerous way, as in many of our street drugs, or it can be done in a much more controlled and precision-engineered way. One of the problems with the mind-brain is that it's got a whole host of mutually inhibitory feedback mechanisms, and let's say by boosting one particular neurotransmitter subtype, you actually inhibit the function of another transmitter. Hence, in many cases, drugs that boost serotonin function impair dopamine function, and dopamine is very important a neurotransmitter. It's involved in willpower, euphoria, well-being, drive, and so it has to, you really need to have a twin-track approach.
hang on to two words there, serotonin and dopamine. They are two important chemicals in the brain that all the mind and mood-altering drugs seem to do things to, blocking them, freeing them, mimicking them in some way. Serotonin is linked to the sleeping-waking cycle, to dreaming, to temperature regulation, to moods and the fine-tuning of how you see reality. Dopamine is involved in all the pleasures that we feel, to euphoria and to control of sex hormones. And it's on these and on other neurotransmitters that leading-edge brain scientists are now focusing.
My name is Susan Greenfield. I'm a university professor in pharmacology at Oxford.
What is pharmacology, actually?
Well, people think that pharmacology is all about drugs because that comes from the Greek word for drugs, pharmakos. But really what we like to think of it as in Oxford is more the study of what we say chemically sensitive sites. We're more concerned with how chemicals working in the body can be modified by agents that some people will regard as drugs. So it's not necessarily all about drugs and just drugs on their own, but rather how they work in the body.
Let's go back to these receptors, these locks and keys that the a drug or an agent introduced will somehow trigger the chemical or fool the brain into thinking that this is the right key for this lock.
That's right.
What I want to ask is, how come our brain has got these locks that match so many cannabis, tobacco, opiates, that there are apparently, I've been told, receptors in the brain that match these?
That's a fascinating question, and perhaps the best example of that, and the most established now, comes from findings in the 1970s that, to my mind, represented one of the biggest advances in brain research of this century and was discovered in Aberdeen. And what it was found was that we have naturally occurring opiates, morphine, in our brain. Until that time, people knew that morphine was one of the most powerful drugs, both in terms of abuse and in terms of analgesia, in terms of therapy. It's one of the oldest and most powerful drugs that we know of is opium, of which morphine is a derivative and heroin a derivative of that. In the 1970s, it was discovered that we had in our body special receptors that the opium or the morphine or the heroin could work on. It was then discovered that there was in our bodies a naturally occurring agent, a transmitter, that was just like the morphine. And that's called enkephalins, literally meaning in the head. And this was held with great excitement, and now we know a lot more, that the body does have a mechanism that can be involved in the control of pain, for example. It's also the same agent believed to be released during something called jogger's high. That's to say when people do a lot of long-distance running, after about half an hour they feel euphoric. And that's now associated with increased levels of this enkephalin.
Is there a way one can trigger one's own enkephalins naturally, then, and not need any drugs at all?
Exactly, and this is one of the reasons people try and get people who are depressed to engage in lots more activity. It's undeniable that if you take exercise, you do feel a lot better. And another way we know that you can release endorphins is with laughter, and again, a marvellous way. If you could get people to laugh, then if you're doing that rather than taking drugs would be marvellous. There'd be no side effects, it'd be cheap, you wouldn't need a medical practitioner, you couldn't overdose on it. It wouldn't matter what culture or age you were, anyone could do it.
With me now is Dr. Andrew Weil, well-known author. His latest book is called 8 Weeks to Optimum Health. He's also the author of Natural Health, Natural Medicine, Spontaneous Healing, and also 2 books on the subject of plants and drugs. From Chocolate to Morphine, Everything You Need to Know About Mind-Altering Drugs, and a famous book from the 1970s, The Natural Mind, A New Way of Looking at Drugs and the Higher Consciousness. Dr. Weil, can you tell me why are human beings, this species, so interested in intoxication, in altering their moods and their minds?
In The Natural Mind, which was published in '72, I postulated that human beings are born with an innate drive to alter consciousness. And this is based on observation. Now, I don't say they're a drive to get intoxicated, because I think that's one variety of consciousness alteration. My sense is that what we find most aversive is boredom, and what we find most reinforcing is change in the area of consciousness. And I think as you go up the phylogenetic scale, you find this desire to alter consciousness becomes more and more prominent, and it reaches its peak in human beings. I also think that human beings in most cultures quickly discover that drugs are one way of satisfying this need. But I think unless society acknowledges that need and addresses it, we have no hope of coming to any terms with intoxicants in our midst.
If we take it back in human history, back into evolutionary history, I mean, how far back does this start, do you think?
I think it's there from the beginning, and even if you look at drugs, which most people early on were using in plant form, the only culture that I know of that was not heavily invested in growing, distributing, using drug plants were traditional Eskimos who had the misfortune not to be able to grow things and had to wait for us to bring them alcohol, which they quickly learned to abuse.
One reason why we've evolved a brain at all comes from the fact that we are animals. And if you're an animal, unlike a plant, you're animated. Now, I know that plants in certain cases can turn to the light and so on, but they can't translocate unless you believe in the day of the Triffids or something going in, or read Shakespeare with Burnham Wood. But most usually, plants are fixed to one spot, whereas animals, the hallmark of animals is that they are moved, they're animated. And there's a very interesting little story of a tunicator, a sea squirt, a little marine creature, that spends its immature part of its life swimming around, and it has a very primitive brain, and then it fastens to a rock and lives out its adult life by filtering seawater so it doesn't have to move. And once it becomes immobile like this, it consumes its own brain. So it doesn't need a brain once it becomes stationary. So the idea is that we've evolved a brain because it enables us to have a rapid interaction with the environment. A plant doesn't need that because things for plants don't change very quickly. The light changes slowly. It doesn't have to make very rapid adjustments to survive, whereas we do, which is why we're equipped effectively with a very quick sensory input of things coming in. So through our 5 senses we can know what's going on in the world, and of course we can react quickly, we can move, we can run, we can chase, we can hunt. So the brain has evolved as such to enable you, we think, to interact rapidly with the environment.
The most fundamental thing is that as animals, any animal is by definition dependent on plants. There are no animals that aren't dependent on plants, either directly or indirectly. And therefore our evolutionary history has been tied in with plants from the very, very beginning.
The artist and zoologist Jonathan Kingdon, whose latest authoritative book is The Kingdon Field Guide to African Mammals.
We, animals, have been eating plants from the beginning, and that has meant that plants have had to contend with this as a major force, as they've evolved. I think the most obvious aspect of it is that the plant is trying to protect itself and producing chemicals which are often highly specific to the particular creature that is its prime enemy. But very often, if it's having a strong effect, it may be right on the edge of being a poison. And we do know that a lot of drugs, a lot of plant compounds, which are taken by animals, by wild mammals, and by human beings, if you take too much of them, of course you die. If you are a particular type of individual, you also die anyway, even if you take a very tiny quantity of it. But if you've got a genetic resistance to it, then you may be able to take it in quite large quantities without it doing you any harm. And it may indeed even give you pleasure. And the chemistry of plants is such that it can affect so many different... We're a web of systems. I mean, we've got a blood system, a nerve system, we're coping with air, we're coping with temperature, we're coping with so many different environmental pressures. And for all of those, there are chemical balances that are just right, and we can push one way or the other. And we may actually enjoy getting, rather hot or rather cold as a result of taking some kind of spice, which has that physiological effect on us. Now, for somebody else, or for another animal, just making you feel hot or making you feel cold may be the thing that tips them towards death, if you like. And so it is a definite deterrent to another animal. So we're actually latching onto the plant's strategy against other animals to a great degree, because the vast majority of the plants that we do use as drugs and that we do use as compounds to stimulate ourselves or whatever, none of them were designed for us, because most of them are not African, and we are African apes by origin. And so all our
sort of highly refined relationships with plants are all restricted to the plants of the African forests and the African savannas.
Space. 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 Space.
My name is Christian Reetsch. My basic professional field is ethnopharmacology, and I'm specialized in the use of plants by indigenous people, and also specialized on shamanism. And I do a lot of traveling and researching, collecting plants, trying them out, taking pictures, writing books, articles, do some lecturing here and there. And I've been almost in every place on this planet.
You're the author as well of a dictionary of sacred and magical plants. You're an ethnopharmacologist. You study how native people use these plants. How far back does human interaction with plants go?
Well, to the beginning. I mean, it's very difficult to estimate how long people use plants, but they use them since earliest times. And there is also some evidence that plants were already used for magical purposes, or for healing, or for rituals in Paleolithic times. And we have some evidence that Neanderthal man already used some bioactive and even psychoactive plants, as offerings to the dead or something like that. And from the earliest beginning of writing, we have records of the use of plants for healing, for magic, for offerings to the gods and goddesses, and the use of incense. I mean, plant materials had been used as incense almost everywhere, and from all the written sources we have records that this is part of human culture since culture is formed.
Smoke is something right at the root of our distinctness, that is Homo, as distinct from, gorillas and chimpanzees. Smoke is one of the things that defines us. Because when we built fires and we sat either in caves or in shelters over a fire, we would have exposed ourselves to an enormous amount of smoke. And probably any individuals that were hypersensitive to smoke were eliminated through natural selection at a very early stage in our ancestry. And this is pure guesswork. But I would be very surprised if there weren't particular woods that people say, "Oh, lovely, I really like that smell." And they would have selectively collected those woods when they wanted a kick out of it. But they would have just been put into the fire for maybe 1 million years, that might have occurred. And they would have just kept them and stuck them in the thing. And eventually, then it would begin to be controlled.
I think this is confirmed by early archaeology. There are a lot of sensors, they call them, either for burning opium or for burning cannabis, that are seeds or leaves are put on and the smoke comes off.
And that could be, in a way, the first step towards having a pipe. I think you have to find the roots of nearly all these things in hunting people, much more than in agricultural people. Hunting people would have known so much more about animals and plants than any agricultural people. Agricultural people, by definition, have narrowed their relationships with animals and plants to a minuscule degree. And foragers really know an enormous amount about their environment. They may clothe it with lots of mythology, but even the mythology generally has some sort of strand that links it in a functional way with the organism's real biology.
To me, one of the most interesting findings is that the human brain has receptors that fit molecules produced by plants. And that's very curious. Why does the brain have receptors that fit molecules produced by the opium plant? I mean, that certainly suggests that there is a link between human beings and human consciousness and plants that extends very far back in time.
Some would say this is purely an accident, but are you suggesting that there is a coevolution here?
Yeah. Even if another one, we find the neurotransmitter molecules like serotonin, for example, in one-celled organisms. So these seem to be molecules that are very conserved in evolution. To me, it suggests that there is linkage.
Andrew Weil. Now, one man who spent much of his life exploring that linkage between plants and people is the writer Terence McKenna, the impish guru of natural psychedelics. I first came across Terence McKenna when he co-edited with Howard Rheingold the fall 1989 issue of that always interesting California-based magazine, Whole Earth Review, a remarkable issue whose cover story was The Alien Intelligence of Plants. Terence McKenna.
Plants represent an order of existence that is completely alien to most people, and yet all around us. Plants cannot move away from their toxic byproducts. Consequently, they have a great stake in recycling and keeping the atmosphere and the environment clean and uncontaminated. Plants have a wonderful integrated passivity that makes them a model for certain aspects of human consciousness. So basically, we just wanted to call attention to this alien life form in our midst, often as saturated with neurotransmitters as our own brains are, and then to discuss the ways in which human beings can contact or participate in this kind of consciousness.
One of the things you suggest in your article, the sort of keynote article of this Whole Earth Review, Plan, Plant, Planet, is that you could see the green world as having influenced us enormously. Not us in control, but the plant world has been controlling the mammal life.
Well, an evolutionary biologist once remarked somewhat facetiously that animals are something invented by plants to move seeds around. And if you stand back and look at it, that's not far wrong. Plant life dominated the planet long before the rise of higher animals, and plants continue to be the major life form on the planet. The atmosphere is controlled by the gaseous intake and outtake of plants. Many plants live in the sea and establish the environment of the oceans. This is really a plant planet, and animal life is only an incidental and late addition to biology here.
The issue also points out that plants can defend themselves and work through chemicals, and immensely subtle chemicals. And is it your case that, in fact, it is those chemical messages that have helped human beings?
Well, it's a great mystery why plants would produce and sequester compounds that have no apparent role in their own metabolism. And I think once you entertain the idea that these so-called tertiary compounds are messenger molecules, pheromones, if you will, then what emerges is the picture of biology united into a seamless web by the exchange of message-bearing chemicals in the environment. We communicate with spoken language, but insect societies are run by pheromones, and it now appears that many plant activities are mediated by these same messenger chemicals. Essentially, chemicals lie beneath the surface of language and communication in plants and animals. Nature is trying to communicate with human beings.
with almost all of these drugs, I mean, same with cannabis, although we didn't discover this until quite recently, there's a receptor in the brain, for THC. So there is a fit between our brains and these substances produced by plants.
Now, what does this tell us then? I mean, what is the...
Well, many scientists and medical scientists get very upset if you try to read meaning into all of this, but I've never hesitated to do that. To me, it suggests that there is a logic in our wanting to go around and experiment with plants and see what they do to us. My sense, and this again was a major point of the natural mind, is that the reason that there is this evolutionary drive to alter consciousness is that these experiences potentially are doorways through which we can discover expanded potentials of the human mind and human consciousness. The potential benefits to be gained through this kind of experimentation are probably great for us as a species. And that's why this drive is so present.
So in fact, legislating about it, if it is such a primary evolutionary drive, legislating
is futile. I mean, it's that simple. And furthermore, there is not a shred of evidence from anthropology or history to suggest that it is possible to get human beings to live without mind-altering substances. As I said, the only culture that's out there that I know that has done that were Eskimos. But every other human culture that I've ever looked at has been heavily involved with the production, distribution, and consumption of mind-altering substances. And then you start from there and see, well, what can we do about it? How can we reduce the potential for harm? How can we encourage people, if they're going to use these things, to use them in responsible ways, and so forth. But I think any social program that begins from the assumption that you can make these substances disappear or stop people from using them is doomed to failure.
Plants of Power, a 6-part radio series about mind-altering drugs in nature and culture. Written and presented by Nick Rankin. Plants of Power. Program 2, Spirit Power.
Well, history shows that we have always used drugs. In every age and every part of this planet, people have pursued intoxication with plant drugs, with fermented fruits, and other types of chemical substances.
Psychopharmacologist Ron Siegel, author of Intoxication and Fire in the Brain.
And surprisingly, we're not the only animals that do that. Our research teams have found many examples of other animals that pursue intoxication with plant drugs and fermented fruits. And this drive to intoxication is so strong, it's so persistent, that it functions very much like the drives of sex, hunger, and thirst that motivate us, that motivate our lives, and that drive our behavior.
There's no region of the world really where plants grow that people haven't used them, not only for medical reasons and for food, but also for their psychoactive properties.
Richard Rudgley is an anthropologist. He's the author of Alchemy of Culture, Intoxicants in Society, and a forthcoming Encyclopedia of Psychoactive Substances. So what do the plants of power do?
Basically, you can divide them simply into a few categories. You have plants which are called stimulants, obvious ones being the coffee and tea plant, but most cultures have their equivalents, which basically help you when you're feeling tired or to give you extra energy for some mental or physical task. Then you have hallucinogenic plants which cause visionary or auditory hallucinations. Then you have what are called hypnotic plants, a lot of which, such as opium, cause states where basically they're the opposite of stimulants. They make people relax, they relieve mental or psychological pain, or physical pain obviously, where they interface with medical use. And finally, the inebriants, which the most classic one, of course, being alcohol.
Now, there's a stream of intoxicants that flow through our lives today. It doesn't matter whether we wake up with a cup of coffee or a line of cocaine, or we take a break from our work with a cigarette or a beer, or we relax after work with a cocktail or a joint of marijuana, or we try to get to sleep at night with something we bought at the pharmacy or something we bought from our street corner dealer. People use drugs to change the way in which they feel. We are chemical organisms. Our brain is a 3-pound sack of chemicals. Of course, we're more than that, but we are that too. And our brain manufactures lots of natural chemicals. We manufacture opiates, which are as strong as any kind of heroin or morphine. Our brain manufactures dimethyltryptamine, an hallucinogen that is stronger than LSD. Our brain and our nervous system manufactures adrenaline, which is a stimulant that's as strong as any crack or amphetamine. So it's natural that in foraging around in our environment on this planet, we will find other chemical substances that we have affinity to, that hit our receptors and strike us as being pleasant. And it's also going to be natural that we're going to find chemicals that we don't like, that we respond to with aversion. So we are just responding to these chemicals.
But how people respond to chemicals depends, we're told, on the set and the setting. That's the set of ideas or expectations someone has about the substance, and the setting is the place and time and the other people around you when you take it. It does matter whether this is a sacred ceremony or a casual habit. Richard Rudgley thinks that for the earliest people, the astonishing chemical reactions of certain plants had spiritual consequences.
There's no question when you look at the archaeological literature, the literature of the ancient world, and also the experiences of contemporary tribal peoples, particularly shamans, that psychoactive plants have had a central role in the religious history of mankind.
Now, you used the word shaman there. Can you explain to me what a shaman is and the origin of this word?
Well, the word itself comes from a Siberian tribe, and then it was used by the Russians, and from there it reached the Western world. And now it generally means people who are living in tribal societies who have what in other areas are called medicine men, but they go specifically into trance states in which they perceive the origin of diseases, and then by medical practices they seek to cure their patients. Often, and this is where it's rather different from Western medicine, by them taking the drugs rather than administering them to their patients.
Saman or shaman is a Tungus word from one of the tribes of Siberia.
That's right, yes.
Are plants in any way, psychoactive plants, mind-altering plants, involved in shamanism in its original place of origin?
Well, in Siberia there are certain peoples who use the fly agaric mushroom in shamanism, the famous fly agaric mushroom, which is the well-known mushroom of fairy tale illustration with the red and white cap. It's one of the naturally occurring hallucinogenic substances.
For the tribal hunter-gatherer, living embedded in nature and instinct and surviving by skill with animals and plants, the mental world is the spiritual world. A mind-altering plant, changing the nature of reality when ingested, would, for our prehistoric ancestors, have been a sacred plant. For who could doubt this fruit of Eden's stunning power of ecstasy and trance? And who could not respect the strange person, the shaman or shaman, possessed by that power, or somehow channeling its impulses and insights?
I think that, yes, shamans are very interesting because they clearly belong to the hunter, food gatherer phase.
Artist and zoologist of Africa, Jonathan Kingdon.
Anybody who could actually invoke hidden powers to provide fruit, the person would have been almost turned into a shaman anyway. And that does seem to have been one of the roles of shamans, that they actually interceded with the hidden powers to provide or to create the harmonious situation in which there would be plenty of food. And I think that there again, this mystery, the mystery of how you could starve sometimes and you could be full of plenty at another. Food was very, very abundant, and then suddenly it would be withheld. It was so easy for people to actually see this as the result of a malevolent power, which was a projection of a, if you like, a senior person. So a senior person then became the agent, in a sense, for this hidden power. And that, I think, would have been the sort of sequence that would have led to shamans. But this is purely speculation, obviously, and I don't think there's any evidence anywhere for the real origins of shamanism.
I definitely think that the origin of shamanism was the human encounter with psychoactive plants, because these plants are still the most important tool in shamanism to enter the other realities.
Ethnopharmacologist Christian Rech, author of another forthcoming encyclopedia of psychoactive plants in German.
We have now so much evidence for the worldwide use of psychoactive plants as the main tools of shamanism that we can really suppose that this is the original method and that it's very old and that the plants actually produced shamanism, and they also produced what we might call religion or mysticism or something like that.
That is an idea that Weston Labar, the anthropologist, author of the famous book The Peyote Cult, proposed in an essay, that in fact the origins of the sacred and of religion itself is in consciousness-changing plants. Do you hold to that view too?
Of course, I mean, definitely. I mean, it's really easy to understand if you take a psychoactive plant by yourself. You're just thrown into another world, into another reality, and there you see unbelievable things. You meet incredible creatures, and all kinds of stuff is happening. And if you experience this by yourself, then you can feel that there is another reality and that this reality is very important to know and to interact with, because this other reality is not separated from our visible world. It's like immanent. It's in this world.
Professor Susan Greenfield of Oxford University. We've been talking about religion here and drugs. People want to change their consciousness. You could have an ecstatic vision, perhaps you could have an experience of God in some way. It would change your life. Now, consciousness, our sense of knowing ourselves, here's the most simple question of all, what is the relationship between our brain, the physical wetware in our skull, and our consciousness?
Well, if I could answer that, I think by now...
You'd have the Nobel Prize.
Well, at the very least the Nobel Prize. That'd be, that, of course, is one of the biggest challenges in biology today, and one that fascinates me. I find it the most exciting question one can ask. Now, that doesn't mean to say one can answer it. I think one must, first of all, draw a distinction between consciousness and self-consciousness, in that most other animals, and indeed very young children, are not conscious, and that you don't have a rat looking at itself in the mirror and saying, God, I'm a rat, I don't think. But consciousness, leaving aside self-consciousness, consciousness itself is a fascinating issue, and one that I think actually, to come full circle, drugs will offer us the most progress in understanding for the following reason. If you just look at properties of the brain, as people that build in computers do, or indeed like many neuroscientists do, where they're looking at the electrical signals, then you never know how those electrical signals will match up or cause you enjoying the sun on your face or the feel of fresh grass on your bare feet. You'll never know those things. Philosophers, on the other hand, say that what's important is the subjective experience of consciousness, the feel of my headache to me. Now, until recently, it's been very hard to bring those two worlds together to understand subjective feelings, sort of feelings that, let's say, a drug will give you, with what happens in the brain. But it strikes me that drugs are indeed the bridge, the kind of bilingual link, if you like, because we can talk about how the drug works in physical terms, how it affects the transmitters and the receptors and the neurons. And of course you can have someone saying how they feel when they take a drug or reporting their experiences. So as long as you don't mind having a second-hand insight into someone's consciousness, that is to say, as long as you don't mind having to rely on what they report, their subjective reports, you can start to match up subjective sensations with what we know they're doing to chemicals in the brain, the more we might start to have some insight into how those reactions relate to those chemicals in the brain.
One kind of drug that we haven't talked about are the hallucinogens.
Surely.
Now, this is an interesting mental experience. What is happening if people are hallucinating?
Okay, well, it's not just people that take hallucinogenic drugs that can hallucinate. We know that certain types of schizophrenia can lead to the illusion that you're hearing voices or that there's cameras hidden in the light bulbs that are watching you. So
fever can do it.
Yes, indeed. So we know that it's not just drug-induced. One could argue almost that when you dream, you're hallucinating because you're certainly not registering simply what is out there in the environment because nothing is there. So I wouldn't like to think of just the LSD taker as the only person that's hallucinating, although they are a good example of it. Now, this is one example of when I said drugs can be used as a bridge to understanding what people feel and what's happening in their brain. Hallucinogens offer a very exciting bridge between those two worlds, if you like. The fact that you can see something glowing colours or you can see something that's not there at all raises the question of the brain not just as some passive sponge that is taking in the inputs from the outside world, but is actually doing something, generating something in its own right that gives you that illusion.
I use a very useful analogy which helps simplify and explain what goes on inside the brain when someone is having an hallucination. Think of a man sitting in a study, and he's looking out the window, and he sees the people walking out on the street and the traffic moving by. And as night falls and he looks out the window, he can no longer see out because it's completely dark. But let's say he has a fireplace behind him, and he stokes the fire, and the fire burns brightly, and he turns around to look out the window. He still can't see out because it's dark, but he sees a reflection of himself in the glass, and the furniture reflected as if it came from the outside. The analogy is that the window is the window of our eyes, our ears, and our senses to the real world. And the fire is the degree of electrical excitation that many drugs can produce in the brain. So when it's dark at night, not much is happening, and the fire roars brightly, you have a lot of LSD in your brain, let's say, you may no longer see the real world, but you see the furniture of your own mind, memories, your images, your fantasies reflected as if they came from the outside. And some people become like Alice, going through the looking glass. They believe all of this stuff is really there. The good news is that as soon as the fire dies down and the drug wears off or is counteracted by another drug, perception returns to normal and you begin to see your own reflection again and you begin to see the room.
Ron Siegel's clear example is the materialist scientific way to see this brain event. But it's not how the old ecstatic shamans think. They do step through that window or penetrate the membrane to the other side. The hallucination is true, says Christian Rech.
For me, it's so clear and obvious that the plants contain something which might be called a spirit or a soul or some consciousness, and when I ingest such a plant, I have the feeling that this part of the plant uses my own consciousness to express itself through me.
What you've just been saying confirms exactly what Terence McKenna was saying to me in that in evolutionary terms, the plants need animals not only to propagate their seeds, but to communicate.
Yeah.
Because animals can move and plants can't. So are you saying that part of the story of the shaman is that the plant is teaching the shaman?
Of course, and the shamans view plants as teachers, as masters, and as allies. And they say, if I take a plant, the spirit of the plant will talk to me, and I can ask the spirit, hey, what you for? What is your purpose? What can you do? Can I use you for healing, or can I use you for something else, or how to prepare the plant and all this stuff? And so there is a dialogue between the shaman and the plant, and the shaman learns from the plant, and then he later can use this knowledge to use the plant wisely. And I think that is the best view for understanding psychoactive substances and plants, that they are teachers and we learn from them, and what we learn from them is very important for ourselves, for our community, for the earth, and maybe for the whole universe. We never know.
Not all shamans use mind-altering plants, but all shamans use music and trance to achieve ecstasy. Shamanism is found in all continents, often hidden and out of the way. Shamanism is still strong in South Korea. The shaman there, man or woman, is called Mudang, and the symbol is a tree between earth and sky and two dancing figures.
My name is Jo. Jo Hung. Similar name is Jo. And I'm professor of cultural anthropology at Hanyang University, specialized in religious anthropology.
What is the history of shamanism in Korea? When does it begin?
From the beginning of the Korean history. It is well known that the founder of Korea, Dangun, was a shaman. At that time, the religion and politics is not separated. So Dangun was a shaman, and then the kings till the beginning of the so-called the Three Kingdoms, say 3rd, 4th centuries, they were shamans. It is so accepted in Korean history.
What is the connection between shamanism in South Korea and shamanism in, say, Central Asia and Mongolia? Is there a connection?
Yes. The Korean shamanism has, in many elements, something to do with the Central Asian or Siberian shamanism. Example, the dance and the ecstasy, or the crown, the well-known Korean, the so-called national treasure, the kumgwan, the golden crown, as the typical shamanistic head covering, as the Siberian tradition.
This is the Gyeongju National Museum in the southeast of Korea, and right in front of me, behind a glass cabinet, is one of the headdresses that I'm talking about. These are the headdresses, the golden headdresses of the original shamanic kings of Silla. And there's a circlet of gold that goes around the temple, but above them, sticking up like trees, are these towering gold ornaments. They look exactly like trees, or they could be horns, and they're hung with coins of gold, beaten coins of gold, and cashew nut-shaped pale jade jewelry. And it's like a forest of trees above the shaman's head. The shaman then was a king as well as a priest. On his head he wore the great symbols, the power plants of his religious and political power. The American Indians originated out of Central Asia and came across the Bering Strait, and yet the New World seems to have more mind-altering plants than the old, at least that were discovered and used by people. Why is this?
Richard Schultes, who's the world's leading expert on the botany of hallucinogenic plants, has said that this isn't down to natural factors. In other words, it's not because the plants aren't there. He's been seeking a cultural explanation, and in conjunction with the theories of West and Laval, who you've already mentioned, what we're looking at is the survival of shamanic cultures much longer in the New World than in many parts of the Old World.
Now, if we look at shamanism has a direct contact with the world of the spirit or the world of the divine. Are you saying that the cultural explanation is that the people who came from Asia, who had, I don't know, vision quests or wanted altered states, were therefore actively looking for plants that would help them do this?
Well, this is the suggestion of Labar, and I think it makes a lot of sense, because if you go back, way back, basically when societies were much simpler, generally speaking, the men did the hunting and the women gathered the plants. So we would expect that they were the ones perhaps who discovered many of these psychoactive plants. I think they were looking for food plants, we know that. They were looking for medical plants, and really in a lot of native cultures the difference between medical use and what we would call drug use is not so clearly defined as in our own culture. So a hallucinogenic plant would be considered purely on that criteria alone to have medical properties. So they would have valued it, and so they would have been looking for it as they pushed into new environments.
And they certainly discovered them, because the New World has, I believe, Schultes has said, over 100 plants that are used for their psychoactive properties.
Whereas in the Old World, with the rise of the world religions, for example Christianity, Islam, and also with the Judaic tradition, these religions, although of course we have wine as a sacrament and so on, they in fact actively resist the idea of using hallucinogenic plants, obviously in part of their religious quest. So they have tended to suppress or to simply wipe out these earlier religious traits.
Professor Cho, you're an expert on Korean shamanism. Now, do we not say that shamanism is in fact the first religion, the primal religion of the earliest peoples?
Yes, you're right. According to the religious evolutionism, the shamanism was always at first place of the history of the religion. Well, it's good, but in interpretation of this evolutionism, we have regarded the shamanism as the primitive. It's nonsense. Typical ethnocentrism. The Western civilization, or the Christian civilization, or the mechanistic civilization have ruined so much the environment or the beautiful nature of the world. And shamanism. Such kind of a religion is very important for the Aboriginal people. They have their own philosophy and their own their wonderful, I would say, harmonious world, and they've lost in Korean shamanism. They always think that we are persecuted, etc. The shamans cannot say openly that we are shamans. They lie, No, I believe in Buddhism, etc. So,
it's a repressed belief system. It is hidden, but it runs like a river underground. You may not see it, but the river is still running.
Not underground. Yeah, underground. You're right. And I would say the shadow, or in night, at night. The Korean shamanism is believed at night. Very strong still, but at days, they must hide themselves,
In the daylight world of Hyundai and Samsung and Daewoo, is it? Different gods. And we'll be looking at how industry and empire profaned the sacred plants next week. Till then, goodbye.
Plants of Power, a 6-part radio series about mind-altering drugs in nature and culture. Written and presented by Nick Rankin. Plants of Power. Program 3, Industrial Power.
All of the plants that we discuss as being narcotic have all had sacred context. Now all of the context has been lost, and this is what we need to reestablish and understand.
Emeritus Professor of Botany William M. Bowden, author of the classic work Narcotic Plants. One of the oldest of these is the opium poppy, Papaver somniferum. It's been cultivated for thousands of years for food and as a painkiller. Opium was also deeply bound in with the religion of the ancient Greeks.
I believe the historical traditional use of opium was that of associating it with the gods, because we know that it was consecrated to Nyx, the god of night, to Morpheus, the god of sleep and dreams, and to Thanatos, the god of death. So it was known in a sacred context. And one of the dilemmas of our own society is that we make categories that didn't then exist. For example, among the North American Indian, food and medicine were one word, and the concept was one. And even religion becomes involved with these. And there was a broader context for understanding these plants.
And how does the drug come out of the poppy?
For a long time, opium would be known only through the crude opium, which is achieved by growing the plant until it blossoms, and then after the blossoms fall, depending on the nature of the collagen, within 3 to 12 days, you may gather a latex by slicing the green capsule. It forms a seed capsule that is filled with seed, and if you don't cut it deeply, you can still harvest the seed from it. And so this white milk oozes out. A few days later, this can be scraped from the capsule as a gum. The gum made into balls, and these crude balls of opium, ranging in size, of course, probably from initially maybe the size of a marble to ultimately the size of baseballs. These were shipped around the world, and they weren't kept in any one area for long, because we know that it was a very short time before the plant was grown in areas like India, Turkey, and pretty soon Burma, Assam. Now one of the great centers of cultivation is Colombia. We worry about the problems with coca in Colombia, but there also are enormous crops of the opium poppy.
For 125 years, opium was one of the most profitable export crops the British Empire had in India. In 1850, opium alone earned 20% of the subcontinent's revenue. Every chest of prime opium from the Ganges plain contained 40 cannonballs of narcosis weighing 1.5 kilos each. Thousands of these 60-kilo chests were exported on fast-sailing ships to China to make addicts of the Chinese pipe dreamers and to spearhead other trade and other missions.
The Chinese really wanted more valuable things than this, what they called black foreign mud. This was their name for opium in Chinese. It translates as black foreign mud. And yet it was forced upon them. The Portuguese forced it upon them initially, and then it continued until finally they had to fight in around 1840 of the First Opium War, and 15 years later the Second Opium War, to finally rid the country of this habit that had been pushed upon them. The crude opium contains a lot of other toxins. This is the dilemma of the use of crude opium, and also the problem with those who smoke it. The rich classes would smoke pure opium, raw opium, and those who couldn't afford to do that would use the draw, so that which was left over in the pipe. And that was left with thebaine, papaverine, narcotine, and other strychnine-like alkaloids that have a very profound effect on the system and can lead to death in a very short time. And so we had classes of people according to their ability to pay for these various kinds of opium.
And pay the Chinese people did. That's how Britain's last colony, Hong Kong, first got on its feet, with the drug-running business done by the likes of William Jardine and James Matheson, men who made their shameful fortunes and then shamelessly retired to England to become members of Parliament. Benjamin Disraeli recognised the type in 1845. "Oh, a dreadful man," he wrote in his novel Sybil, "a Scotchman, richer than Croesus, one Mr. Druggy, fresh from Canton, with $1 million in opium in each pocket, denouncing corruption and bellowing free trade." Opium smoking was the servitude of Asians. Progressive Europe, with its industrial and scientific revolutions, could do far better, according to Professor Roy Porter of the Wellcome Institute for the History of Medicine in London.
From the beginning of the 19th century, chemists begin to subject raw natural opium to chemical analysis in the laboratory. And that takes place particularly in France and in Germany. And there's a French pharmacist called Seguin, and then a German pharmacist called Sertuna. And these are the key figures here. Seguin is the man who isolates morphine, as we call it nowadays, from opium. You take raw opium, sort of put it in a test tube, boil it up, add alkaline substances in order to remove impurities, and you end up with a nice, clean, clear, crystalline substance. Seguin didn't really understand what he'd got, but the German pharmacist Sertuna did. He knew that it was alkaline, he knew it was special, and it was from then that morphine regularly became extracted from raw opium.
Now, there's another development in science that's very important, linked to morphine and other drugs, and that's the invention of the hypodermic syringe. What does this represent in science, and how did it come about?
Always the problem with drugs, whether they are medical drugs or illegal narcotics, is how do you get it into the body? How do you get it into the system? And it wasn't really until the 1830s that the idea of injecting drug substances into the bloodstream by the use of a syringe became really tested. Now, syringes were old, but the new idea of a hypodermic syringe, using a syringe with a hollow needle to inject under the skin and directly into a vein, that really was developed in the 1850s. There was a great big dispute amongst the doctors then as to who it was who had really invented the hypodermic syringe. But on the whole, we nowadays in this country think that it was a Scotsman, Alexander Wood, who was the first person who really popularized that. And once you got the syringe, then it became possible to inject morphine directly. The effect was much more rapid and much more powerful. It's one of the terrible ironies of history that the first person to die of an overdose of drugs that were injected hypodermically was indeed Alexander Wood's wife. And this is symbolic of something that was happening in the 19th century, which is that doctors were very, very keen on the effects of morphine because it was a wonderful painkiller, there's no doubt about that. There was a great deal of dispute and doubt and uncertainty about how far these drugs really were addictive or not. And one of the theories in favour of the injection of drugs beneath the skin, directly into the bloodstream, was the belief that that method would not prove addictive. It was only by eating or swallowing drugs that addiction would follow. So there was a hope that you'd actually avoid addiction by hypodermic injection. That, of course, is absolute bunkum, but that's the medicine learns by its mistakes. And what you get from about the 1860s onwards is an enormous epidemic of what was called morphinism. That's to say, addiction to morphine that was originally doctor prescribed. Doctors actually encouraged their patients to carry their own hypodermic syringes and to inject themselves. It was thought then to be fairly safe. It proved a complete disaster.
There were more addicted women in the latter half of the 19th century than any other class. We usually think, oh, it must be a lower class person or a black person or some other person. No, it was white, middle class to upper middle class women who were being addicted by physicians. And the reason for this was if they had a migraine headache, which was common, they were given opiates. And if they had tight corsets that cut off their circulation, they had poor digestion, they were given opiates. Just any disease, it was the cure-all for a while. And then morphine addiction became so common that the synthetic heroin was produced, and heroin was thought of as a cure for morphine.
Heroin is a sort of derivative from morphine. You make heroin by boiling up basic morphine with another substance called acetic anhydride, and then you get this hyper-concentrated form of opium in the form of heroin. It was first made in London, in St Mary's Hospital in the 1870s, but then it was manufactured by the German Bayer pharmaceutical company from the late 1890s. It was on the open market. You could buy it in lozenges and pastils, as well as in liquid form, and it was recommended as a cough remedy, as a remedy for tuberculosis and things like that, and as a great painkiller. And it proved infinitely more addictive than morphine. So what was seen as a cure of morphinism turned out to worsen it.
Why is it called heroin?
The people who developed heroin in the 1890s in Germany saw it as the most powerful reliever of pain ever. It was a heroic remedy, heroisch, the German word, and so it got called heroin as a sort of brand name.
Andrew Weil, Dr. Andrew Weil, you're the author of From Chocolate to Morphine, Everything You Need to Know About Mind-Altering Drugs. It's true, isn't it, to say that when industrialized countries come across mind-altering plants, they extract and increase the power, the potency and the power of these plants by not treating them as natural plants anymore.
Yes, or even when they don't do that, they treat the plants in ways that maximizes abuse potential. And I think another interesting example to look at is tobacco. Now, here's a plant that is the chief sacred plant of many Indians in the Americas. When the Spanish came to the Americas, they found Indians smoking tobacco. They'd never seen anyone smoke before. Smoking was unknown in the old world before 1492. But if you look at the ways Indians were using tobacco then, most of them were using it as a ritual drug. The forms of tobacco in use were very harsh, so you couldn't inhale them deeply and often to form the pattern of addiction that we see in our cultures today. There are Indians in the Amazon that build giant cigars of very strong tobacco, and on feast occasions they take turns puffing on these things and get very high from it. But they don't do it very often. This is an occasional use. I have an Indian friend, a shaman of a tribe in California. One of his titles is a smoke doctor, and he uses a lot of tobacco smoke in his healing ceremonies. He was taught by his elders that tobacco smoke is to be taken into the mouth, blown out the nose and mouth, that the smoke carries prayers to the spirit realm. You're not supposed to inhale it. He said that was a white man's mistake and that we're now paying for our error. In America, just after the Civil War, the tobacco industry developed a new form of tobacco, a new genetic strain, and a new method of processing it that produced for the first time a smoking product, the modern cigarette, which could be inhaled deeply and often. And this establishes the brain pattern of dependence on nicotine, which is the root of tobacco addiction today, and the source of immense grief, as you know. Here again is an example of, I think, where we've gone wrong with the drug plant, that rather than seeing it as something to be used ritually, sacredly, perhaps occasionally, we have maximized its harmful element in the way that we've prepared it and distributed it for use. So here's a case where we haven't taken the drug out of the plant, but nonetheless we have maximized the destructive potential of that plant.
Tobacco was considered the great aphrodisiac. Once a plant was spread as an aphrodisiac, its reputation became very, very great. And we'll find with many of these sacred plants that was indeed the case without any validity. For example, even with chocolate, it was an aphrodisiac, and that's why it was spread so rapidly. tobacco traveled because of its reputation, but the tobacco seed is as small as can be imagined. It's like dust. You could literally hold 1 million tobacco seeds in your hand, in one hand. So it was easy to pack up the seed, and in any climate that was reasonably temperate for a brief time of the year, you could grow at least one of the varieties of tobacco. The tobacco was carried about as seed and was introduced to diverse parts of the world to be used in every imaginable form, from snorting, snuffing, cigars, in every form. And again, I would return to that idea that we're dealing with a seeming aphrodisiac, which isn't really not so. But the idea that it does break neural synapse and it does give one a relief from the boredom of the day or whatever ills might be plaguing one for a time leads to ultimately addiction. And it seems like only recently we've been treating this as an addictive drug, whereas I remember even in my own book I had treated it as an enigmatic. I called it tobacco the enigmatic narcotic, and at that time no one was treating tobacco as a narcotic.
Tobacco smoking began as shamanistic ritual in South America, became democratized through the shared peace pipe of North America, and has now been sold to everyone around the world by big business. Andrew Weil insists that the active drug nicotine in the tobacco of cigarettes is highly addictive.
When you inhale tobacco smoke, this is a very direct way of introducing nicotine to the brain. It's one step down from drilling a hole in your skull, putting a needle in and giving little pulses of nicotine to deep brain centers. Inhalation of vapor is a very, very direct way of taking a drug into the brain. And there are centers in the brain that respond very powerfully to nicotine. And once this cycle is established, the brain craves nicotine about every 20 minutes. And I think it's fascinating that although this is right in front of our eyes and something that everybody could see, when I was in medical school in the late 60s, I was taught that cigarette smoking was not an addiction, that it was a psychological habit, and therefore it wasn't important. It wasn't anything we had to study. Even though, as I said, right in front of our eyes we can see that people who use this substance have to use it every 20 minutes. There's nothing else like that. And it took the medical profession a remarkably long time to begin looking for what was the basis of this behavior.
What happens is, though, that when you get an industry that can influence politics and create jobs and all the rest of it, you have vested interests.
Enormous vested interest. Actually, in America, where I know the history of this quite well, tobacco was the first cash crop that the colonies had. So it was the first thing that they could trade for money with England and with Europe. So tobacco has always held a very special place in the economy of America and of England as well. When I hear presidents of the United States, as a recent one did, calling for a drug-free America, I have to laugh. No one wants to see a drug-free America. We'd like to see an America free of the drugs we don't like and don't make money off of. But as for the ones we do, that's business as usual.
Philip Morris, the world's biggest tobacco company, exported 662.2 billion cigarettes last year. That's over 6 packets for every man, woman and child on the planet. The 80% increase in foreign sales over the last few years is mainly to Asia. William M. Bowden can see what's happening.
We spoke of the use of opium and the opium wars. We're doing to Asia precisely what Great Britain was doing to China in the 19th century. We're pushing all of our tobacco into Asia, and we're addicting as many people as we can, trying to create Asian markets and literally forcing it upon these people. We won't give them food, but we will give them tobacco. There are so many goods that they need in terms of food and medicine, and yet we give them tobacco because we need their addiction, so they will be able to constantly purchase tobacco from us.
We've touched on opium and tobacco, so how about cocaine to make a trinity? Yet again, we seem to have taken the wrong path, according to Andrew Weil.
The whole history of cocaine, I think, is probably the best example we could find of what you should not do with one of these drug plants. We came to South America, where the Spanish did, saw Indians chewing coca. Their immediate reaction was that this was something satanic and horrible, and they tried to stamp it out. They quickly found that they couldn't do that, in particular that if they wanted Indians to work for them in their mines, they had to give them coca. So then they began to tax coca and take control over it. But they never tried it themselves. Again, they saw this as a dirty habit of people who they considered subhuman, and they didn't try it themselves, even though Indians told them that this was a superior remedy and very good for the Constitution and helpful with altitude sickness and so forth. It took remarkably long time before European scientists took any interest in coca. Really not until the middle 1800s. And then very shortly after they did, a German scientist isolated cocaine from the leaf. And cocaine was released to the world as the active essence of coca that embodied all of its principles. So research on coca leaf stopped, and everyone began experimenting with cocaine. And as you know, in the 1880s, cocaine was widely promoted by the medical profession as a cure-all for everything. And widespread addiction followed in the wake of that. So this was entirely medically created. And then when there was a great public outcry about the harmfulness of cocaine, the medical profession took the position, as it has in many instances since then, that it was not their fault, that the problem was that the drug itself was bad, with no redeeming qualities, and that the ultimate source of the badness was the plant itself. So cocaine was banned, instantly creating a black market for it. And now we're at the other end of this, where our society is now relentlessly involved with trying to eradicate coca in South America and prevent Indians from using it, because we blew it.
So, to the rescue, once again, the greatest ethnobotanist of this century, Richard Evans Schultes of Harvard University, who's dedicated his whole life to understanding how American Indians use plants. Richard Evans Schultes sent his best student, the late Timothy Plowman, to South America to study the plant Erythroxylon coca. In his much-praised book, One River, the anthropologist Wade Davis has written about both men.
Tim Plowman was Schultes' protege. I once asked Mrs. Schultes whether Tim had been as close as a son to the great professor, and she shook her head and said no closer than a son. Tim was the world's expert on coca. In the early 1970s, Schultes sort of managed to do the impossible, secure from the U.S. government $250,000 to study this plant known as the divine leaf of immortality, and of course the notorious source of cocaine. And even though the cartel was emerging, and even though the efforts to eradicate the fields had been underway for over 50 years at that point, astonishing little was known about coca. Nobody knew how many species yielded the alkaloid. Nobody knew anything about the pharmacology of coca chewing. Nobody had even done a nutritional study of the plant, even though it had not only been maligned by physicians, but it was something that was consumed every day by literally millions of South American Indians. And so on a journey made possible by Schultes, inspired by him and certainly infused at all times with his spirit, Timothy and I traveled the length and breadth of South America, studying the ethnobotany and the taxonomy of this most wondrous plant of the Inca. And what we found was really quite amazing. I mean, at one level, coca symbolized the very fabric of Andean life. There was no gesture that could be begun without some kind of use of the coca leaf. When you met people on the trail, you didn't shake hands, you traded leaves. Distances were measured in the Andes not in miles or kilometers, but in coca chews. There were societies where the entire societal ideal was to abstain from sex, eating, and sleeping, and do nothing but chew the sacred leaves and chant to the ancestors. There were coca diviners who read the future in the venation of the leaves, a skill that could only be possessed by someone who had successfully survived a lightning strike. And the Inca themselves, unable to cultivate the plant at the elevation of the imperial capital of Cusco, had actually replicated it in gold and silver leaf in fields that colored the landscape. And when we did the first nutritional study of the plant, what Tim found was rather astonishing. It turned out that coca, yes, it had a small amount of cocaine in it, 0.5 to 1% dry weight, roughly analogous to the amount of caffeine in a coffee bean. Amount of cocaine absorbed in a very mild and natural form through the mouth in a slow fashion that left it completely benign, a mild stimulant in a harsh environment. But what Tim also found in the plant, much to the regret, I think, of our backers of the U.S. government, was it turned out that this plant was just chock full of vitamins. Not only was it full of vitamins, it had more calcium in it than any plant that had ever been studied by the USDA. which made it perfect for the diet of the Andes that traditionally lacked the milk product, particularly for women that were nursing. It also turned out to have enzymes in it which enhanced the body's ability to digest carbohydrate at high elevation, which made it perfect, of course, for the traditional potato crop diet of the Andes. So in one single gesture of research, if you will, Tim showed that this plant was a benign stimulant that in 4,000 years of being used by Indian peoples and all the pre-Columbian civilizations of South America, in the Andes rather, had never shown any evidence of toxicity, let alone addiction, and that it was a fundamental part of the nutritional regime of the people themselves. So this plant that had been so maligned was revealed to be what it was, the true divine leaf of immortality. And this revelation, in some sense, put into stark contrast the draconian efforts financed and organized and promoted by the U.S. government that certainly persist even more so today than they did 20 years ago, to poison the coca fields with all the various herbicides and insecticides that today pollute the headwater rivers of the Mother Amazon herself.
By the way, I think it's also worth noting that our drug policies, which in the U.S. began about 1914 with the passage of the Harrison Narcotics Act, which mentioned cocaine, have directly led to the disappearance of coca and coca products from our world, while encouraging an ever-expanding black market in cocaine, which is easy to smuggle. I mean, nobody's going to smuggle coca leaves, which are bulky and have very low amounts of the drug, and everybody's going to try to smuggle this concentrated white powder, which is worth so much money. So I think our drug laws and drug policies have directly contributed to the wave of abuse that we have by driving out of circulation the natural form of the drug, which has a much lower abuse potential, and encouraging commerce in this isolated chemical, which has a very high potential for abuse.
And therefore encouraging gangsterdom, criminality,
and
violence.
All of it. As I said, it's a real object lesson in what not to do when you encounter a drug plant in the world. I think the history of coca and cocaine provides the best illustration of all the things that we've done wrong, culminating now, as I said, with our attempts to prevent natives in South America from using their sacred leaf.
Plants of Power, a 6-part radio series about mind-altering drugs in nature and culture. Written and presented by Nick Rankin. Plants of Power. Program 4, Alcohol Power.
The discovery of most of our major psychoactive drugs came from early man watching animals.
Dr. Ron Siegel, who's been researching animal behavior with drugs for 25 years.
For example, the legendary discovery of coffee was by an Abyssinian shepherd who noticed that his goats became abnormally frisky after eating the bright red fruit of this plant. And when he tried the fruit, he found that indeed he became a little frisky too. And that's how coffee was discovered. Coca, from which cocaine comes, was discovered the same way, according to folklore, by native Andean Indians watching their llamas and their alpacas eating these leaves. And they copied the behavior. Almost all of our drug plants seem to have been modeled after animal use. For example, elephants really don't have a lot of drug plants in their environment, but they have very keen olfactory receptors, and they can pick up the scent of fermented fruit from long distances, up to 75 miles away, with a good wind. And they will migrate out of their way in Africa to get to this fruit. Now, this fruit is only about 8% alcohol. It's enough to get them a little tipsy and a little shaky on their feet, but that's about it. When they accidentally wander into moonshine distilleries, they might drink stronger alcohol, and then they will engage in some rather nasty drunken behavior, where they become extremely aggressive, they smash village huts, they stampede, and they have even been known to trample people.
I have seen large vats of brew, fermenting millet in fact, emptied by elephants at night. They've come to a village and they've emptied the vat. That I have seen.
The zoologist and artist Jonathan Kingdon was born and bred in East Africa.
Any animal that associates a particular food or a drink with pleasure in any shape or form is quite easily habituated to that. I know that a monkey that I was brought up with as a small child started to bite me and my friends and was given to somebody, and later we heard that it became a total drunkard. This was a baboon, because he was a heavy drinker himself, took it off to the pubs and used to delight in filling it up with Tusker beer, and it used to fall off its stool to the great amusement of people. Very cruel and unnecessary and unpleasant, but I mean, what it does demonstrate is that primates particularly are susceptible to alcohol, and primates would be, probably of all animals, perhaps with the exception of pigs, the most likely to come across what is effectively alcoholic beverages in the form of great quantities of fermenting fruit.
Dr. Andrew Wild, you've written a lot about drugs, particularly in two of your books, From Chocolate to Morphine, Everything You Need to Know About Mind-Altering Drugs, and your famous book from 1972, The Natural Mind, A New Way of Looking at Drugs and Higher Consciousness. I want to talk about values now, because drug use and the cultures that use drugs and what we call a drug and what we think of as food or something perfectly normal is deeply tied up with the values of a culture and a society.
Now, even how we define a drug. You know, is sugar a drug, for example? There are people that say they get high from sugar, and there are people who say they get addicted to sugar. Is salt a drug? You know, is alcohol a drug? The body can metabolize it like a food. It's clearly a poison in high doses. It's a favored social intoxicant. But I still very commonly hear the phrase drugs and alcohol as if alcohol is something different. You know, so we have a certain set of associations to the word drug. You know, drugs are good if they're being used by doctors for the purpose of healing. They're bad if they're being used by people to get high for fun, at least if it's not one of the drugs that we approve of. So there's a great deal of value in all of this.
Human energy, power and serenity, dream time, real life, vision of eternity.
And the value is commercial too. Some scholars think that the plants of power are a staple of civilization, basic to the trade that has tied the global village together.
These substances are not just part of a cultural history of humankind, they are absolutely integral to the economic history at every stage. Perhaps the precious metals are the ones that are the first stage of international trade, but amongst the next level are these desirable organic consumables.
Andrew Sherratt, you teach archaeology, you're in charge of the prehistoric collection at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, and you're also the co-editor of the volume of essays Consuming Habits, Drugs in History and Anthropology. And you've written the first essay in this, which is called Alcohol and Its Alternatives. And one of your ideas in that is that if you look back in history, there are broadly two kinds of cultures. There are smoking and chewing cultures, and then there are drinking cultures. Can you explain that?
There's a lovely phrase in John Locke's treatise on civil government, which says, in the beginning, all the world was America. And what he meant by that was that the picture presented by the newly discovered Indians of North America was a model for what the original condition of humanity might have been. And in a sense, I think this is a very valuable perception, because when we look at North America, one of the interesting things is the importance of tobacco, the pipe of peace, the ritual use of tobacco, not simply a hedonistic use, not simply being used for relaxation, but a very, very powerful medicine and also a very powerful social tool. Now, the evidence that we have from prehistoric Europe clearly doesn't include things like tobacco pipes, but there are, in fact, quite a large number of rather enigmatic objects with open sides, things that have traditionally been called incense cups or braziers. And putting these two things together, it seems to me entirely likely that what we're looking at are a whole set of rituals based essentially on the smoking and the inhalation of fumes from, well, we have a number of plants to choose from, but let's just leave it at that level for the moment and say that there is evidence that these little braziers were culturally important.
Well, we do have evidence from Herodotus talking about the Scythians, where he saw them throwing hemp seeds, cannabis seeds, inside a tent, a triangular tent, and they inhaled the fumes and howled like animals.
That's absolutely right, and that's one of the best links back to this prehistoric situation. And what really clinched it for me was going into the Hermitage in St. Petersburg and seeing the objects from the frozen tombs of Pazaruk in the Altai Mountains on the other end of Siberia, and they are absolutely exactly the set of equipment described by Herodotus. There is the framework of a little tent, there are the bronze braziers, still with the coals inside them, still with the charcoal, and indeed still with the hemp seeds. It is absolutely astonishing that something that was interred in the ground in 500 BC, or thereabouts, frozen in the permafrost, because that's how these things have been so miraculously preserved, should give such a direct reflection of what Herodotus talks about in Book 4 of his histories. So we can trace back a millennial-old tradition, because these little smoking cups, these little braziers, are found in tombs, the pottery ones are found in tombs going right back to 3000 BC or before. And that, I think, was the general pattern before drinking, before the consumption of alcohol took precisely the prime cultural role that it now has.
The first book of the Bible is full of stories about the plants of power. The first woman, Eve, gives the first man, Adam, a mind-altering fruit, and together they fall from the hunter-gatherer's paradise into the hard work of early farming. Their two sons divide the labor. One becomes a herder, the other a tiller of the soil. The one who grows the vegetables is jealous of his more nomadic, freer brother. This earth-digger, whose name is Cain, kills his animal-driving brother Abel. Then the first murderer goes east, and in the land of Nod he founds the first city. This could be the myth of the first cities of Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, in the country that is now called Iraq. It's important that Cain is a digger and a planter and a winemaker in this story, because, as I put it to Andrew Sherratt, there is no civilization without cultivation first, and urban culture depends on agriculture.
What happened in Western Asia from 6000 BC or so onwards was the development of a second generation of products, things like the tree crops, things like these sugar and oil-rich olives as the oil crop, vines, and particularly dates as the sugar-rich fruits, which of course were very easily fermented. And my own view is that it was with the date that fermentation first became a process that humans were familiar with and then tried to transfer to other sorts of products.
Now, civilization, the living in cities, spreads out of Mesopotamia around the Mediterranean. We think of Greece. All these things are associated with wine. But in your essay, you point out that there are drier peoples who come out of the desert and the semi-desert and out of the steppes. Can you tell me how, say, the rise of Islam, which is not a wine-based culture, came about?
Well, let's go back to my original formulation that, as it were, the aboriginal state of humanity in Europe was a set of smoking cultures or chewing cultures using the psychoactive plants from their native flora. Remember that the opium poppy is part of the West Mediterranean flora. On the east, cannabis is a steppe plant and was used, as we were saying, back into the 4th millennium and almost certainly before. So these things have age-old usages, but I think what one can see in Europe is the tremendous prestige associated with drinking and the elaborate gold and silver drinking vessels that were made for the elites of the period. So the development of alcohol had this tremendous effect on the areas which were capable of producing the sugars that were fermentable into this marvelous drink. But in areas, dry areas like the steppes or the deserts, which were not areas where grapes could be grown or where sugar-rich fermentable crops could be grown, then the habits of smoking, the habits of taking narcotic substances by inhalation continued to be the basis of social life. And indeed, the difference became, as it were, a badge of identity, that the people who came out of the desert increasingly during the 1st millennium BC and in the 1st millennium AD to dominate the town dwellers, hard-riding, camel-riding nomads who despised things like the use of the wheel, who despised the drinking of wine, who despised the use of silver vessels and all the luxury and ostentation and degenerate city life that went with it. In a sense, they created their own identity in opposition to this by emphasizing what was different about their own way of life. And so we have this proscription of wine drinking, which in a sense is an attack on all that city-dwelling Mediterranean civilization stands for. It sums it up so perfectly as the quintessential product and consumable of its everyday life and indeed of its religions. And so to proscribe this, to forbid it, was a very powerful ideological statement. But of course what wasn't forbidden was the consumption of the kinds of stimulants or narcotics that were traditionally in use in the desert. And further south, the use of coffee on a very small scale, the berries were originally chewed, was typical of the way in which things like cola nuts in West Africa, things like gut in East Africa and Somalia were used as stimulants. So these came to have much greater cultural prominence, these and things like cannabis.
As I've said, I think that almost every culture uses intoxicants. We tend to see the intoxicants we use as being good or okay, and the intoxicants that other people use as being bad. But there's no agreement from culture to culture as to which are the good substances and which are the bad substances. You know, if you're in the mainstream in our cultures, alcohol is our chiefly accepted substance, mind-altering substance. But if you're a Muslim, that's the big bad drug. You know, and all the things that are said that we say that marijuana does to people, for example, they say alcohol does to people. And sometimes within countries you find different subpopulations who are at war with each other, and their different choices in intoxicants become symbols of the differences. For example, in Peru, Peru is a country with two nations that have always been at war since the Spanish conquest. There's a Spanish-speaking mestizo population with its capital at sea level at Lima that uses alcohol as its preferred mind-altering substance, and an Indian Quechua-speaking nation with its capital at high altitude in Cusco that uses coca leaf as its chief substance. I was in Ethiopia some years ago, and there you have a Christian alcohol-drinking majority and a Muslim minority that chews a leaf called khat, which is the closest thing that nature produces to amphetamines. And within these countries, there are incredible tensions, and the choice of intoxicant becomes symbolic of a whole subculture.
The Coffee Cantata, written by J.S. Bach in 1733. I must have coffee, pour me coffee. In the 17th and 18th centuries, tea and coffee became the new and fashionable stimulants of the cities of Europe. Both hot drinks, brewed from leaves and berries respectively, contain caffeine, which excites and alerts the cerebral cortex. But this became a socially acceptable addiction.
To a certain extent, there was a replay of this tension between alcohol and non-alcohol, in the sense that alcohol was very much associated with the landowning aristocracy, and therefore a rising middle class in the same way, wanting to differentiate itself, wanting to create its own identity, its own sense of respectability, naturally promoted tea and coffee and these stimulating substances that kept you awake rather than alcohol that tends, at least with me, to send one to sleep. This is what the middle classes did. The cup that cheers but not inebriates, as Cooper so wonderfully put it. And so you get a sort of replay of this cultural divide between Christianity and Islam, but now on social grounds between the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie, expressed in the temperance movement.
The temperance movement, which urged people to moderate their alcohol drinking or to abstain altogether, reached its peak in the United States of America, a country which began as a Puritan experiment, but whose history has always been awash with alcohol. In the colony, in the Republic, everybody drank. You could even see the US's expansion westward as a tide of alcohol once again eradicating the smoking cultures of the plains dwellers as the wine of civilization had overcome the barbarians of old Europe. Drink ravaged American Indian cultures, and yet booze seemed to be spiritual, a kind of shortcut for vision-seeking warriors. As William James, the father of American psychology, observed in 1902, the sway of alcohol over mankind is unquestionably due to its power to stimulate the mystical faculties of human nature. Sobriety diminishes, discriminates, and says no. Drunkenness expands, unites, and says yes. It is, in fact, the great exciter of the yes function in man. The drunken consciousness is one bit of the mystic consciousness. But now it was time to say no. A coalition of women, doctors, and clergy began to preach the evils of the demon drink, and the temperance movement became unstoppable at the beginning of this century. Edward Baer, author of Prohibition, The Years That Changed America, takes up the story around the time of the First World War, 1914 to 1918.
There was a movement that in a way superseded the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, called the Anti-Saloon League, which was probably the first modern lobbying movement in America, financed by the churches, but also by large industrialists like Henry Ford, Pierre Dupont, General Motors, Edison, Rockefeller, and they managed to turn the Anti-Saloon League into a very powerful, financially rich lobby. And this lobby behaved with utter ruthlessness. Wayne Wheeler, who's now completely forgotten, but was probably the most important behind-the-scenes political figure in America at the time, he consciously fostered an anti-German movement, and he attacked the brewers because he said the brewers were kind of fifth columnists in America, which was totally untrue. But by the time America had entered the war, there was already the feeling that prohibition was around the corner.
And it's interesting, there's a parallel that over in England, the licensing laws that restricted the drinking time under Lloyd George's government were also introduced in the First World War in order to keep working people in the munitions factories in order. So business and industry were keen on stopping drink for their
Absolutely. Another sort of key element in all this is that the American Industrial Revolution, personified by the Ford technique of making cars, the assembly lines, meant that for the first time you couldn't afford to have a kind of drunken or hungover lumpen proletariat. You needed skilled, sober workers, which is why Henry Ford created a force of private policemen who would spy on his workers. And a worker who was caught buying wine or beer or whiskey in a shop outside his working hours was first warned, and if it happened again, he was fired.
So this is the beginning of mandatory drug testing in the workplace.
Absolutely.
Now, the Volstead Act was passed in 1920. Calvin Coolidge called this one of the greatest social experiments in the world, and it was. It lasted 13 years. Here was a major industrialized country that said, we will outlaw this plant product, alcohol, we will make people better. But as you've already hinted, it all went completely wrong. How did it go wrong?
Well, it went wrong almost immediately in the sense that I think on the night after the proclamation of the law, a train full of whiskey was hijacked. And this was a sign of things to come. When you consider that whiskey, a bottle of whiskey, for instance, smuggled in from Canada, could be sold at 20, 30, 40 times the original cost. This meant that people were making huge amounts of money. And with limited amounts of liquor coming in, because it wasn't easy, it wasn't completely trouble-free, this meant that the gangs were at each other's throats to commandeer, kidnap, hijack stocks of liquor. And most, for instance, of the shootings in Chicago involved rival gangs who were fighting over quantities of liquor that one gang brought in and another gang wanted. This is, for instance, the real reason for the St. Valentine's Day massacre. It was a banal commercial dispute. That's what it was.
Prohibition ended in 1933. It ended as a failure, didn't it?
It ended as a complete failure. Many of the prohibitionists became anti-prohibitionists because they realized that the moral standards in America had just plummeted and that corruption meant that authority was no longer respected. Even people like John D. Rockefeller, and Rockefeller, in fact, wrote a letter that was published in the New York Times, which was a kind of tearful confession that he'd been wrong, that the prohibition that he had worked for hadn't worked because it had brought in its wake more criminality, more corruption, and indeed disease and death, because a lot of the liquor that was being made locally was lethal, and tens of thousands of people died or were blinded because of this. And there was a great deal of self-interest among the people like the Rockefellers, because in November 1929, Wall Street crashed, fortunes were lost, the country itself went into a deep depression. When a country is in a deep depression, it's very difficult to raise taxes simply to keep the government, the administration going, so taxes went up. And suddenly, belatedly, all these moral prohibitionists realized that if only one could tax liquor, if only liquor became legal again, then they themselves would be paying less taxes.
Alcohol is taxed and licensed and is thriving. Now in Britain, the drug is being marketed to children and to young people as Alco-Pops, flavored with sugar and fruit juices. But we're meant to be in a global war on drugs. This is a term that irritates Dr. Ron Siegel.
It's not a war on drugs in any country, because I don't see wars on pharmaceutical medicines, which are far more lethal than heroin and cocaine wrapped up together. I don't see a war on alcohol, really, which is, in the United States, is killing 500 people a day. I don't see a really deliberate war on tobacco, which is killing, in the United States, 1,000 people a day. I don't see helicopter teams trying to eradicate tobacco plantations in Kentucky the way we send in helicopter teams into South America to eradicate coca, which in the 5,000 years that coca has been chewed, it has never killed one person. Not one death in the medical literature attributed to chewing of coca. Now, there are probably 5 to 6 deaths a day due to cocaine. That's of no small concern to those 5 or 6 people or their families. But from a public health point of view, that's a small number. compared to the larger numbers of alcohol and tobacco deaths. So we only have a war against some drugs, not others.
And Dr. Andrew Weil agrees.
All this while, we've been living with the drug which is the most dangerous of all, alcohol. This is the drug which, any way you look at it, is the most toxic. It's the one that is chiefly associated with toxic behavior. It's got a very high association with suicide, with homicide, with violent crime of all sorts. It's the only one that causes irreversible medical harm. And as well, we've been living with tobacco, which in the form of cigarettes is the most addictive drug known. So it seems to me that there's some irony here, that while we periodically become upset about these drugs that other people use, in general they come nowhere near the potential harm of the intoxicants that we freely promote and encourage the use of.
Plants of Power, a 6-part radio series of mind-altering drugs in nature and culture. Written and presented by Nick Rankin. Plants of Power. Program 5, The Power to Choose.
One of the things that we must remember is that plants are powerful because they produce powerful chemicals.
Psychopharmacologist Dr. Ron Siegel.
All of our major drugs are chemical substances known as secondary substances or alkaloids. Plants have no known use for alkaloids. They do not need them for their metabolism or for their growth. They produce them as a byproduct of plant synthesis, and they produce them for one reason only, because they are chemical defensive agents intended to keep animals away. Plants taste bitter. They cause numbing sensations. If you eat too much of it, you'll throw it up. If you manage to keep it down long enough, you'll cause physiological disturbances, liver damage. And if you manage to keep it down long enough for it to be absorbed, you might get intoxicated. You might get dizzy. You might not survive. So it makes real good sense for the plant to produce this. It's a wonderful chemical warfare agent. And it makes really good sense for animals to evolve mechanisms to taste the bitterness, to detoxify the alkaloids, to develop good livers and good enzymes, and to develop good brains, learn to stay away, and to minimize their intake of these substances, and to vary their diet accordingly. What we have done, being the clever primates that we think we are, we have picked apart these plants, we've concentrated down the chemical or the drug that's in them, we've devised mechanisms for injecting it directly into our bloodstream or smoking it into our lungs. Animals don't smoke in nature. And then we ask, why do we have drug problems? We have drug problems because we're screwing around with Mother Nature. We're taking relatively benign medicines, relatively safe medicinal plants, and we're turning them into poisons. And I submit to you that all of the drug problems that we have as a species on our planet today are due to dosages and patterns of use gone haywire.
Well, I'll tell you what, I used for 30 years heroin and cocaine. I was on methadone for years, very, very sick. I was the kind of mother that shot dope with my older son, and we used to deal drugs together. And I brought my younger son solo into the world of drugs, and it was a nightmare.
Dr. Randolph Nessie, you're Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Michigan and co-author with George Williams of Evolution and Healing, the New Science of Darwinian Medicine. Now, human beings have always taken psychoactive plants that have changed their consciousness. That is true, isn't it?
And not only humans, chimpanzees quite clearly seem to use drugs from plants, perhaps both to heal themselves and for pleasure.
For pleasure. How much does our feelings come into this?
Most of the drugs of abuse, obviously, make people feel better. That's the simple explanation. Why do you take drugs? Because it makes me feel good. The emotions are useful, and there's got to be brain mechanisms in there that make those emotions work. There's got to be dopamine and serotonin and nerves and all the rest. Once you have a mechanism that regulates behavior based on chemicals, then if an individual has access to outside chemicals instead of the natural ways of stimulating them, those chemicals are going to change those emotions, either for better or for worse. It looks quite clear that most drugs that either cause pleasure or cause behaviors to be repeated cause the release of dopamine in certain areas of the middle of the brain, which tend to both cause pleasure and to make that behavior repeated. Amphetamine does that, cocaine does that, and marijuana does as well. And thus, organisms, when they get a chance, take chemicals. But there's something very different happening now than over the past several thousand years of people taking chemicals. What's happening now is that we have new chemicals, we have them more pure, we have them more available, and especially we have different routes of administration than we ever had before. People have always used opium, people have used alcohol. In fact, some of my anthropologist friends suggested the very origins of civilization were in making grain so they could ferment it, so they could have a reliable source of alcohol. But they got distilled alcohol. They were never able to buy as much as they wanted, so they could drink every single day to intoxication. The modern environment challenges individuals with chemicals of a purity and degree of availability that's completely novel in our evolutionary history.
So, how is our brave new world coping with the chemical crisis? Heavy-handedly and wrong-headedly, say some.
American drug policy is heavily dominated by a criminal justice approach that relies very heavily on a moralistic rhetoric, on a demonization of anybody involved with illicit drugs.
Ethan Nadelman, head of the Linda Smith Center, the Open Society Institute's drug policy think tank in New York City.
If I'm asked what do I think is really driving American drug policy, it probably boils down to a combination of fear, prejudice, ignorance, and profit. I mean, ignorance in the sense that people are dreadfully unaware of what drugs are about. If one were to give the ordinary congressman in the U.S. Congress a multiple-choice test on simple questions about drugs, they would probably do worse on it than a chimpanzee guessing randomly. Okay. Now, in terms of prejudice, I mean, look at the origins of American drug laws. I mean, the first anti-opium laws in this country were 1870s and 1880s in California and Nevada, and they were directed at Chinese immigrants who was feared would take their opium and seduce white women and turn them into addicts. The first anti-cocaine laws were directed at the blacks in the first decade of this century, who once again was feared would take cocaine and be impervious to the bullets of sheriff's rifles, as well as seduce white women. The first anti-marijuana laws were directed at Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans in the Midwest in the 1920s and 30s. Once again, these people would smoke marijuana and have a good time, and it all seemed awfully strange, so we criminalized that as well. So there's an enormous amount of prejudice underlying these laws. Now keep in mind also that at least in the United States, when somebody says junkie or dealer or something nasty, the image that comes to mind in most people's eyes is a person with dark skin. So to some extent, in American society, it's no longer possible to speak nastily in public about women or minorities or blacks or Latinos or even homosexuals. But if you're involved with drugs, it's carte blanche. Anything can be said whatsoever. And this becomes a way, I think, of demonizing inner-city black and Latino people in this country by mixing them, assuming that they're all involved with drugs. Now, I talked about fear. Well, fear because we're all afraid of dark-skinned people getting crazed on drugs and forgetting their place in society. But fear also in a very understandable sense. I mean, there also is this fear that every parent has, that every parent wants to put their child in a bubble and to protect them. And, we now have seatbelt laws and helmet laws, and we have all sorts of safety things that those of us who are in our 30s and 40s and 50s did not grow up with. We want to protect our kids. And the great fear is that somehow drugs, or even this dialogue that we're having right here, will somehow pierce that bubble and make our kids more vulnerable to drugs. So I think that's an area where tremendous empathy and compassion is required. Yet at the same time, the United States now has a war on drugs that's costing tens of billions of dollars a year. We have increased from 50,000 in 1980 to 400,000 the number of people locked up in this country for violating a drug law, an 8-fold increase in the last 16 years. I mean, unparalleled. Why are we doing all this? Well, oftentimes it's justified as to protect the kids. Why do we have to drug test everyone in the workplace? Is to protect the kids. Why can't we let a sick person smoke marijuana if it keeps their nausea down? Well, it's to protect the kids. Why can't we allow a junkie to have a clean needle to reduce the spread of HIV and AIDS? No, we can't because it's to protect the kids. I mean, to some extent, we've mounted this massive drug war. It all is sort of being justified as one great big child protection act. Now, the bottom line is we do need to protect our kids, but it's not by a criminal justice warlike policy, heavy on moralizing and rhetoric, and very low on truth and respect and human decency.
Right, my name is Jenny Mears. I run a project called Drug Busters, which is all about teaching children how to make informed choices about drugs, helping them to be aware of the different types of drugs that are in their community.
How old are these children?
They're 11 years old. Into 11-year-olds are the children we target mostly because they're the children that are going to be leaving school the next year and going on to secondary school, where we feel that that's where drugs are normally introduced and they become more vulnerable.
You've got in front of us here, there's a suitcase which you take around. It's a black briefcase, and you open it up, and there's a display inside of drugs. Now, they aren't real, they're models, but a very realistic display. Can you take me through, and how do you tell the children about these drugs and what they really are?
The idea of this drug suitcase is two things. One, to explain and break down to them the different types of drugs there are, but also another thing which is important to me is for them to discuss and identify whether these drugs are in the community or whether they've actually seen any of these drugs on the market. I'll take you through the cannabis. I think the cannabis is one of the most popular drug there is on the market. There's a lot of debate about it. Some people say it should be legalized. Some people say it shouldn't. That drug is one of the drugs that has a real confusing issue about it in the community, but it's one of the most popular drugs used. Apparently it has an effect on people in the fact that it causes brain damage and it gets them dizzy and it makes you lazy. And that's why I think the people think it's dangerous, but other people say it's not dangerous. So it's a difficult one.
Now, in the suitcase, there's amphetamine powder, coffee, and nicotine. You've got a cigarette butt, and do some coffee now. Well, it's true. In this program, Plants of Power, we've been talking about coffee and tea. They are plant drugs. I mean, they are stimulants, and alcohol is one too, and you've got it down at the bottom here. The point is there's a whole range of them. Some of them are legal, some of them are prescribed by doctors. You've got steroids there, which bodybuilders take. You've got benzodiazepines, which is temazepam and sleeping tablets. You've got cocaine and crack.
Yes, cocaine and crack is a drug that needs to be taught to children because it is so highly addictive. Once you've taken it, you need to have more and more. In particular, the crack drug. You know, it's very highly addictive, and that's what causes burglary. It can cause you to, lose your job. It can, lose your family. It has a terrible effect on you. So, yes, I do teach them about that drug.
I don't know just why it gets you so high, putting a buzz in your heart. You do a marathon, you wanna go on, kicking the steel in the pot, they call it wacky dust. It's something you can't trust, And in the end, the rhythm will stop. When it does, then you'll stop. The happy wacky does.
When people are chewing coca and they're ingesting small amounts of cocaine and it's absorbed very slowly through the mucous membranes in the mouth and the throat and the stomach, they get some mood elevation, but they don't get euphoric. But when you take this alkaloid, this chemical from the plant, and you inject it directly into your bloodstream or you smoke it, and in 6 seconds it goes from the lungs to the brain. It takes 14 seconds, by the way, when you inject a drug to go from the site of injection to the brain. That feels real good. But when you smoke a drug, it only takes 6 seconds, and that's so fast that we have had male subjects in the laboratory smoking cocaine and having orgasms. And it's testimony to how nice this alkaloid feels in the brain. The brain is wired to do this. And this is why we have such an attraction to this particular plant drug.
I think one should separate drugs that are used therapeutically from drugs that tend to be abused. But one should think in both cases about how they influence the normal adaptation of normal folks. Most drugs that are abused stimulate brain systems regulating positive emotions. They don't keep doing that for very long. Now, the history of an individual's drug use very often is that desire for the drug starts growing and growing, even as the pleasure produced by the drug begins to fade. Kent Berridge, who's a psychologist and a colleague of mine at Michigan, he and I have just finished a paper about this exact issue. And he has wonderful evidence, even from rats, that even as the behavior to go get the drug increases and increases, the pleasure shuts off in the brain, thus leaving people trapped, spending their lives craving after and spending all their money and time trying to get drugs that no longer bring them pleasure.
This is the drug prisoner's dilemma. More effort for less pleasure. An expensive spirit in a waste of shame, as Shakespeare described lust in action. Gloria Scott of Venice Beach, California, whom we heard earlier, knows about the hard work of beating addiction. Her method is cool and tough. She doesn't like psychobabble and says if you've got an inner child, you should take it out and shoot it, and then try to grow up and learn the painful home truths with your peers.
The approach is based on the 12-step program, which means Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, and Cocaine Anonymous. That's what our program is based on. And I used it for 30 years, and I have almost 18 years clean. And without the AA program or the 12-step program, I wouldn't be clean today. No way. And part of that is because of the fellowship. You know, a lot of the programs, you go in there and you stay clean for 9 months, you learn about the disease, and you learn what to do, and then you complete and you go outside and you're on the street all by yourself. Now what do I do? You know, and you get all the anxiety. And when the anxiety comes up, you go back to your old neighborhood. But this is based on fellowship, so by the time you're in a program for 6 months, 3 months, 9 months, you know a lot of people on the program, because AA means one alcoholic and one alcoholic helping another one. So the only way you stay clean, the only way I can stay clean is by helping another addict. Well, it keeps me busy, for one thing. But, you know, alcoholics and addicts are very self-centered people. You know, the world revolves around us. We are the center of the universe. And, you know, that's one of the main things of the disease. We're always looking in. We never look out. In fact, we don't give a shit about anybody but ourselves. Getting the drugs, da-da-da-da-da. Alcoholics Anonymous and Cocaine Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous teach us to turn our eyes out. That there's other people here, and we need to work with those other people. We stay clean to help an addict or alcoholic. Well, it works that we're so self-centered that when I'm working with somebody, like if I'm taking them to an AA meeting, or I'm picking them up at jail and helping them, or I'm working the steps with them, whatever I'm doing, I'm not thinking about myself. But when I take them home and it's back to Gloria again, oh, poor Gloria, she's too old, she's too fat, I want to use, da-da-da. That's the way we are. We're horrible. It's typical American. You know, because America, I think, is very self-centered and very selfish. We're a very selfish nation, you know, and we're victims. You know, it's Vietnam's fault, it's, you know, Grenada's fault, it's everybody's fault but ours. We never take responsibility, and neither do addicts. We blame everybody, our mothers, the courts, the police. It's not our fault, you know, that kind of thing. And most addicts don't work, alcoholics don't work, they have all this time on their hands to do nothing. I get you in trouble.
Jenny Mayers. Now, you mentioned crack being addictive, alcohol being addictive. You've got heroin up there, and Chasing the Dragon, smoking heroin, heated on tin foil or injecting it or whatever. Yeah. Addiction. How do the children react to this idea that it can start off as fun, but then you can't stop? Do they grasp this concept?
We hope they do. I mean, within our plays, we have a play called Brain Drain, and we don't actually use drugs in the play. We use computer games because that's another addiction. We ask children to identify what addiction is. Television watching is addiction. Computers, playing football, some of them say is addiction.
Sweets.
Yeah, eating sweets. There's lots of things that are addictive. And the way we approach our drug education program is to try and get them to learn what addiction is, what makes them get hooked, what makes them keep going, what controls their body, what controls their pattern of life.
And in this game, Brain Drain, what actually happens in the play?
It goes way over the top. It's not real. It's about 3 people. One person's addicted to computer games, and her friends wanting her to go out. And she doesn't want to go out because she loves these computer games. And then there's a brain monster that comes and asks her, can he have some of her brains? The computer keeps breaking down, and she has to keep buying these games from the brain monster, who wants to take some of her brain cells in exchange for a game. And it goes on, and eventually he eats all the brain cells. It's a ludicrous play, but the kids love it, and they can identify with the 2 things. I want more games, and in exchange for the more games, you have to give me brain cells. And brain cells are what destroys your brain, because once they've taken the brain cells, you can't think anymore. It was a true fantasy, but they do understand what addiction is through that approach.
I'm Timothy Leary, and I'm 75 years old, and I did act as a PR person for the brain. And the possibilities of changing the brain. Our human race doesn't understand the brain at all. Think about it. DNA did that work for 50 million years to produce a brain with all these receptor sites to have the government laws that they're illegal. But you can't activate these circuits of the brain. But there's a lot of areas of the brain that we haven't even thought about yet that we can activate.
People use drugs as medications to change the way in which they feel. And if we start to think about drugs as medicines, as treatments for the human condition, then we should begin to start thinking about making them safe.
120 billion neurons. We're not using them. We all know that.
Perhaps Dr. Timothy Leary, the late LSD guru who believed we should be activating more chemical receptor sites in the brain, is having the last laugh, and millions of people begin to turn on, or rather turn off, the feelings that they don't like. This chemical control of the mind by blocking negative emotions is something that disturbs Randolph Nesse.
Well, as a psychiatrist, I've lived through the period from when we thought it was probably a mistake to treat emotional disorders with drugs, to a period now when many patients with very serious life problems in the midst of a terrible myriad of problems with children or the like come in and say, I'm feeling bad, please give me a drug to relieve it. A huge sea change in really medical ideology about how to deal with the emotions that's taken place just in a period of 20 or 30 years. And I think we're just getting going. I mean, my prediction is that the drug age, in terms of really novel psychopharmacologic agents, is just getting going. And there are over 15 different serotonin subtype receptors, for instance, and different drugs are being developed right now to stimulate each of those, to block each of those. And people are looking to see what effects those drugs will have on the emotions. And we're just starting to look at other kinds of neurotransmitters and receptors and all of the drugs that will influence them. There's every reason to believe that over just the next 20 years, we are going to invent dozens or hundreds of new medications that will influence people's emotions. Drugs that block negative emotions. Negative emotions like anxiety and sadness and jealousy and boredom and all kinds of things. My belief is that we're very ill prepared to make wise decisions about how to use those agents. One has to step back and ask, what is the function of those emotions, and when is it wise to block them, and when is it wise not to?
Now, in the case of negative emotions, how do you make the judgment? I mean, if you're bereaved, for example, you're going to feel sad. Now, it seems to me, I mean, it may be begging the question, but it seems natural to grieve, to mourn for the loss of a loved one.
It is natural, but do we know what use it does? I mean, what good is it? One can speculate all over the place, but there's no agreement among scientists as to exactly what the benefit is to our genes of grieving the loss of a loved one. We need to know that, though. One very small study, and it's astounding this has not been done more carefully, suggests that drugs like Prozac are really moderately effective in relieving the discomfort caused by grief. One could therefore recommend using that drug more widely, or shouldn't we? These are the kind of questions that we should be asking ourselves, and a whole lot of work is needed.
Is there a point that the negative emotions may be useful in an evolutionary terms? A sense of unease or discomfort, these may be helpful to one. It seems to me also that sadness could lead to things like empathy and sympathy, which are very important. The ability to understand other people's sadness is important in human societies. But what's happening if we're moving into a drug age now where people are not going to face these, are going to take drugs to make them happy? This surely is going to change things.
We're going to find out, I think. It will change things, and history has shown that when people have access to drugs, they will take them. Will it be just terrible? Will this change human nature in a way that makes us all behave maladaptively all the time? Well, when anesthesia first came in for surgery, many people thought one shouldn't use anesthesia for surgery because it was unnatural. Now, the very idea of undergoing surgery without anesthesia is ridiculous. And I can anticipate a time in the future when people might look back at our time and wonder how we possibly could have endured some of the emotional pains that we now experience because we don't have drugs to block them. On the other hand, I can imagine people looking back at our time and saying that was the time when people lived normal, real, full human lives with positive, negative, intense emotions, instead of having them all blocked like we do nowadays, speaking some 100 years in the future. I think this is happening, and the only way that we're going to be able to offer really the world advice on this is to learn a great deal more about the functions of the emotions and how different drugs influence the brain mechanisms that influence emotions. I see this as very urgent work because of the growth of new psychoactive drugs.
The future of the human species is to learn how to use our brain.
Plants of Power, a 6-part radio series about mind-altering drugs in nature and culture. Written and presented by Nick Rankin. Plants of Power. Program 6. Power and Control.
Richard M. Schultes arguably is the greatest Amazonian explorer, certainly of this century, perhaps even of all time.
Anthropologist Wade Davis, whose biography of the Harvard ethnobotanist Richard Evans Schultes is called One River.
Schultes was a very enigmatic character. He was raised in a very poor family in Boston, became the first of his family ever to go to university, and he expected to become a physician, but while he was an undergraduate at Harvard, he stumbled upon the first monograph ever written in English that described the stunning pharmacological effects of peyote, and he became fascinated by that magical plant, and he studied it for his undergraduate thesis. And that launched him on a long and varied career that took him from the mountains of Oaxaca, where he discovered the so-called magic mushrooms, the event that probably more than any other sparked the psychedelic era, and later carried him, of course, into the forests of the northwest Amazon, where he truly made his mark. And Schultes' expeditions took him thousands of miles down unknown rivers, often through areas totally unexplored, living amongst uncontacted societies. All the time he was pursuing the mysteries of the rainforest. He would collect over 27,000 botanical specimens, describe the use of 2,000 medicinal plants, find over 300 botanical species new to science, and really, celebrate the poetics of that land and its people in a way that no other botanist ever has.
I believe that all of us who have ever done anything significant in ethnobotany were students of Richard Evans Schultes.
William M. Bowden, author of the classic Narcotic Plant, considers Richard Evans Schultes as the master.
He has always, through his writings, through his speaking, been the pivotal figure in this entire endeavor of trying to understand these plants in relationship to the civilizations of mankind. And I think all of us must say we owe a great debt to Richard Evans Schultes, as the people of South America have given him honors, but his greatest honor, he said, was when they set aside several million acres of rainforest in his name. He would take this as the greatest tribute, of course, because this is his great love. He has spent over 27 years exploring these rainforests of the Americas and has given us so much original information and so many new ideas, new ways of thinking, changing our ideas.
Among the plants of power that most attracted Schultes were the hallucinogens. This fascination with the most sacred mind-altering plants began with a college library book. There he read about the mescaline-rich peyote cactus, Lophophora williamsii.
Schultes was taking a course at Harvard called Plants and Human Affairs, a course that had been taught at the university longer than any other in the undergraduate curriculum. And in the lab dedicated to these curious plants that were then known as Fantastica, they had to do a book report, and it was racing to get the thinnest book possible on the shelf that led Schultes to that monograph. And as I read it through the night, he read stories and accounts of visions of orb-like brilliance where colored patterns fell like rain upon the skin of all those who took the magic plant. And he became enchanted. In a sense, he fell away into trance. And his professor, who was another conservative Bostonian, said that if you wanted to study the plant, it was one thing to read about it, which he would have to do, but mostly he had to live it.
This is a peyote opening song. The next song is the Night Water Song.
In the summer of 1936, Richard Evans Schultes and the anthropologist Weston LaBarre went to live with the Kiowa Indians in Oklahoma Territory. They took part in peyote ceremonies at night and ate the sacred visionary plant.
The peyote pulp, which came from the plains from Mexico, in some sense was a pharmacological shortcut to distant metaphysical realms traditionally reached by the pain of ordeal, the vision quest, the ardor of battle. And the Kiowa were the very conduit through which that cult came onto the plains and then became disseminated at a remarkable rate of diffusion, reaching by the 1960s even the Cree in northern Canada. And Schultes was the last generation of scholars actually to know the elders of the Kiowa, who had been raised in a way of life that had withered and died within a century of its birth. We forget that the Great Plains culture was not something that had gone on for centuries. It developed with the horse, which only reached the plains in the 17th century. So Schultes had this remarkable initiation into the wonder of the Amerindian civilization. And I think at the earliest age possible, really, as a young academic, he realized that this world doesn't exist in some absolute sense, but is just really a model of reality, and that the lesson of ethnography is that there are other visions, other ways of being and thinking on the earth, and it was to pursue those visions and understand them that Schultes dedicated his career.
The life work of Richard Evans Schultes has centered on the relationship of natural plant materials to the religious and cultural life of native peoples. But William Amboden deplored the way that modern civilization has profaned the plants of power.
The peoples who use these use them in the context of the sacred. We abuse, they use. There's an enormous difference. The person today will snort a line of cocaine, whereas the coquero would chew leaves over a long period of time and get a small amount of cocaine in their system and traverse paths through the Andes. The person who smoked tobacco would blow smoke upon a sick colleague, or would use smoke in a sacred context and not walk about with a cigarette bobbing in his mouth all day. Among the users of peyote, peyote was used only in sacred contexts and only on specific occasions after fasting and abstaining from the use of salt, abstaining from sex. It was a very sacred thing and used in a very specific context for a very specific purpose of understanding. We don't understand a context for the use of any of the things that are powerful and sacred and have the power to enslave us as well. We have turned them into a monetary thing instead of a sacred thing.
How traditional people use these plants of power without problems is vital knowledge for us today. Think Anthony Henman, author of Mama Coca, and Big Deal, The Politics of the Illicit Drugs Business. The example of traditional coca chewing in the Andes has three great lessons.
One lesson is of a sort of green pharmacological nature, that a substance is much more difficult to abuse when it's in a sort of crude vegetable form, that there are certain inbuilt filters that prevent, overdoses and lots of the types of medical problems that are associated with refined substances. The second aspect is that a society like that has a proper ritualized context for the use of these substances. And I don't think that our society lacks that. I mean, we can see that similar types of rituals exist in our society around tea drinking or beer drinking, or in these days even, ecstasy use. I mean, it's not yet become a totally formalized ritual, but nevertheless there are certain types of informal cultural controls which seem to emerge in any society. And if we understood these at a more theoretical level, I think we could design policies which are more adapted to the realities of these substances. And the third aspect, I think, is properly, let's say, ethical. The way to prevent substances becoming negative and damaging and evil and poisonous and so on is actually to say that they're good for something, and they exist in the universe. There was a Jesuit who was sent out to Peru in the 16th century, largely to justify the Jesuits' participation in coca plantations at that time. But he used a basic theological argument, which was, if God created this plant, in this part of the world, he must have done it with a reason, because we know that God did nothing for no reason and for no purpose. And so I would say that what we need to understand is that these substances do exist, that they're not going to disappear, that the idea of forcing them to disappear, of eliminating from the face of the globe, which is what the United Nations and the United States are trying to put on as unrealizable goals, and it would be better to say, well, these substances are useful for something. I mean, coca is useful as a stimulant, the opiates are useful for killing pain, cannabis has a wide range of uses, and so on and so forth, and try and build on the positive uses of these substances, rather than constantly drawing attention to the undoubted negative side effects that can occur.
There's a lot of money in the illicit drug trade today, and as the Colombian economist Oscar Rodriguez Aguilar explains, capitalism has little to teach the Colombian drug cartels.
This is a business with investment, with labor, with transport costs, with sales costs, with marketing costs, with dealership costs, and with profits. And the reason for its success has been not only that it's an illegal business, which therefore generates enormous amounts of profits, but secondly because it has been managed as a business.
Now, I know these are only estimates. Because it's illegal, there aren't official accounts. But can we calculate how much money is being made. What are the figures?
There is a figure which estimates that, for example, in 1978, in just Colombia, when the cocaine boom began, the value of the drug trade, the value, was estimated at $200 billion. But the most recent figures were mentioned at the beginning of this year, 1997, at a very specialized conference in Prague, in Czechoslovakia. And there is a firm called Interaxis Risk Management, in fact, which put forward this figure, which is the so-called gross criminal product of drug trafficking in the world, calculated, estimated at $1,000 billion. Now that figure is roughly just below the United Kingdom's GDP. Now, just in the United States, drug trafficking was valued at $400 billion for last year, and that is roughly more than the GDP for Russia and just under the GDP for Spain, certainly more than the GDP of Mexico and South Korea.
That money can buy a lot of power. Last year, police in Europe seized 11 tons of heroin, 30 tons of cocaine, and 630 tons of cannabis. How much got through to consumers, no one knows. These figures come from Interpol, the International Criminal Police Organization, that's an information clearinghouse for police from 177 countries round the world. 60% of Interpol's time and resources is spent on drugs and organized crime. He won't admit he's losing the war on drugs, but the Secretary-General, the top cop in Interpol, thinks it's time for a change in tactics. From a police family, he's been a policeman himself for 40 years, and his name is Raymond Kendall.
I think we need to get a different approach at political level, because unless there is a political will to do something, it won't happen. I mean, however much we would like as policemen to be able to provoke action here, there, and everywhere, the most we can do, and I think it's our job, is to deal with the distribution network and so on. But if we want to be successful, we've got to do it against a background of some sort of strategy. What happens at the moment is that we find that of the total resources that are being spent on dealing with this problem, about 75% of the resources are being spent on law enforcement activity and only 25% on dealing with the question of demand. Now, it's very clear that if there's that sort of imbalance in the use of resources, that you are never really going to, in a coherent way, come up with a policy that's going to really serve a useful purpose.
So what do you think? You say we've got to change it politically. What do you think the politicians should be facing up to?
It's very nice to put money into law enforcement, because if you increase the size of your drug squad, you will seize more drugs, you will arrest more drug traffickers, but at the end of the day you're not doing anything to deal with the basic problem. And the answer to that, I think, is the fact that if you start dealing with social action and social policies which require enormous investment, the probability of you seeing a valid result is going to wait maybe one generation or 10 years, shall we say. And most politicians don't think that far ahead and wouldn't have the courage to propose that sort of investment.
So what sort of social policy do you think they should be investing in for the long term?
It's a very complex issue because it concerns so many aspects of our societies, not only obviously police, but the judicial system and the social services system as well. For example, in some countries I know, there are legal provisions to deal with drug addicts by way of alternative procedure. In other words, instead of putting them in prison or whatever, obliging them to go into treatment centres and things like that. But the problem is that in most of our countries that provision may exist in the legal sense, but it doesn't exist in reality simply because the institutions are not there to put people in.
Now, Raymond Kendall, forgive me for pushing you on this, but you say there are different ways the law has for dealing with people. Are you suggesting that the users, the people who might be addicted to these things, should not be treated as criminals? Is that what you're partly what you're saying?
No, it's totally what I'm saying, because I think there must be a certain amount of frustration on the part of many policemen who are confronted on a daily basis with having to deal with issues which are social issues as opposed to purely police criminal issues. The police obviously has a social role. You're in the front line there. In the street you are going to come across the problems that are of a social nature, but you should not be called upon to deal with that social side. I think the police role, the law enforcement role, is to deal with the distribution networks right down to street level. What I feel is a waste of time in a way, and waste of resources, is simply arresting the addicted people, putting them through the legal system, as if that in some way or another was going to solve the problem. Now, we have to be careful here, because where I've got into trouble in the past is there are terms which are used, like decriminalization, depenalization, liberalization, and so on. What I'd like to express in the way that you did is to say that I certainly don't think it's of any value to treat drug addicts like criminals. On the other hand, I don't believe in total liberalization. I don't think any kind of drug, be it cannabis or any other, should be legalized. I think that if you want people to go into treatment, you need some coercive possibility, simply because human nature being what it is means that unless there is some coercion, perhaps many people would not voluntarily go into treatment. On the other hand, we can say that I'm sure there's not a single serious drug user that would not want to get off the habit if he could.
Ethan Nadelman is the head of the Lindesmith Center, the Open Society Institute's drug policy think tank in New York City. How would he change drug policy in America? What's the rational way to deal with this problem?
I think one has to look at the underlying assumptions. First, let's change the underlying assumption. The assumption so far has been that we should seek to create a drug-free society. Let's forget that. Let's stop saying it. Let's accept instead that there has never been a drug-free society in civilized human history. That the challenge is not how to get rid of drugs or even how to keep them at bay. The challenge is, how do we learn how to live with drugs in such a way that they cause the least possible harm? Now, that seems to me the more sensible objective. Now, what does that mean in practice? Well, I don't think it means that you legalize all drugs tomorrow, but it certainly doesn't mean that you keep the drug war going the way it's been going. What it means is you start to fight for a more humane and decent and sensible version of drug prohibition that begins to look for public health priorities, that begins to decriminalize aspects, institute better regulations. That means that if you're dealing with junkies who can't quit, you adopt a harm reduction policy. You make clean needles available. You teach them how to shoot safe rather than landing up in a hospital emergency room. When it comes to drug treatment, whatever works. That's different strokes for different folks. You want to do whatever works. If it's oral methadone, do that. If it's what you do in England with injectable methadone, do that. If it's a drug-free program or a 12-step program, do that. If it's prescribing heroin to a hardcore drug addict, as you do in England and now they're doing in Switzerland, you do that. Whatever works to reduce the death, disease, crime, and suffering associated with drugs. Do we need to be sending drug dealers to prison for 30, 40, or 50 years as we do in this country? No. Drug dealers, if we're going to punish drug dealers, should not be punished the same way as rapists and murderers. They're not engaged in the same sort of activity. If somebody's a simple drug possessor, drug user, there's no way that they belong in prison. That's not the place for them. If they're a drug user, don't have a drug problem, then leave them alone. If they're a drug user and they do have a problem, then allow them access to treatment. With respect to marijuana, I cannot understand why marijuana should continue to be treated as an illegal substance. I don't know about broad-based legalization, but when it comes to marijuana per se, it seems to me we need a sensible, taxed, regulated policy with respect to the sale of marijuana to adults. It would earn revenue for the government. It would avoid the loss of revenue that we now spend on the drug war. It would avoid many other problems that we have with the current illegal market. Seems to me it's a simple case. At the same time, alcohol, tobacco, I'd get tougher on that. Just stop short of prohibition. Tax it more, regulate it more, but stop short of prohibition. It's when you go to prohibition that you start to create our current disasters.
This next one is the closing song, the one that they untie the drum.
I think your title, Plants of Power, I think we have to recognize that these plants do have powers. They have particular capacities to change one's awareness, consciousness, whatever you want to call it, in a particular way. And that power has got to be recognized, that power has got to be harnessed, that power has got to be understood, and that power has got to be turned to our advantage. As long as we view this power as being something inherently malefic, it will be malefic, it'll turn malefic, it'll go on producing gang wars in Colombia and destabilizing states and undermining economies and boosting prison populations and generally creating havoc socially and politically across the planet. it's only when we come to a serious, awareness of the powers that these plants have and understand the way in which we can use that for the benefit of society that I think there will be any way to kind of, move forward on this. I think probably the most problematic is not actually cocaine in that respect, but it's heroin, because the opiates do produce a proper physical addiction, which is difficult to treat. What needs to be understood better is the way in which people sort of, just shift from very occasional, largely unproblematic use of heroin into properly dependent, addictive use of heroin. That is a shift which is, something which has got to be addressed, not just as a form of individual pathology, but it's got to be addressed culturally, it's got to be addressed socially. The only example I know of where that worked was a group of Hmong hill tribe people that I lived with, not for very long, but for a couple of weeks on the border of Thailand and Laos. And there, although the young men smoked opium on occasion, like once a week or once a month or once a year or even 2 or 3 nights in a row, they nevertheless were strongly discouraged by the older men from smoking every day because they knew that would produce addiction and dependence. And some of the older men, however, were already addicts because they were suffering from serious aches and pains and so on, and therefore they needed their opium every day. But it seemed to work well as a sort of form of generational control. Young men were not prohibited from using opium, but they were encouraged just to use it on occasion. And there seemed to be a kind of like a form of social learning there that was going on between the old junkies and the sort of, the young experimenters that served to seriously communicate the risks to people who were just beginning to use the substance. And I think one would have to sort of, think along those lines.
Andrew Weil, Dr. Andrew Weil, a botanist and a physician. Ultimately, with drug plants, some are allowed alcohol, tobacco, some are not allowed opium and marijuana. The problem seems to me control, social control, personal control.
I agree.
Where do you stand on this?
I think this is an issue that society needs to come to terms with. These substances have potential for harm. I have always written and said that there really are no good and bad drugs. There are just good and bad uses of drugs. I think any drug can be put to constructive uses and any drug can be put to destructive uses. I think that society should be concerned about drug abuse, should work to try to reduce it. But I feel that the use of the criminal law is completely inappropriate and ineffective. So here's what I'd like to see happen. I would like to see us back away from the commitment to use the criminal law as the vehicle through which we try to influence people's drug-taking behavior. I don't think that means we can undo the drug laws all at once overnight, but I'd like to see them dismantled in a gradual, stepwise fashion while allowing society to adjust to the changes. An easy place to begin would be with the decriminalization of cannabis, for example, since that's the most popular of the illegal recreational drugs. But I think that has to be accompanied by real drug education, because I think education is our best hope. And that means teaching people, and by the way, it's everyone, it's doctors are as in much need of drug education as kids are, about what are really the benefits and risks of these substances. And I think we have to look at it all. It does have to be from chocolate to morphine. It's got to be at all of the mind-altering substances, including the ones that we now profit from. Alcohol, tobacco, the various forms of caffeine. And I'd also like to see gradual restrictions placed against the commercialization and glamorization of all substances, including the legal ones. I think if we began moving in those 3 areas, that is, beginning to dismantle the criminal laws, really working to develop real drug education and restricting the promotion of all substances, we would see the problems associated with drugs begin to recede instead of continuing to get worse as they have for all this century as we've been using the same old methods. I also feel that our best hope is really with social controls rather than legal controls. Even if you look at what's happened, the change with tobacco is quite interesting because, as I said, here is the most addictive substance known. And yet, in America now, there has been an enormous change in smoking behavior. And at the root of this is that smoking is going out of fashion. So this is a social change. And even dealing with such an addictive, difficult drug, this kind of new social consensus is enormously influencing people's behavior for the better. I think that's our best hope. It's not through legal controls. One of the observations that I presented in The Natural Mind that I have seen again and again is that in these Indian cultures in South America, where there were no criminal laws, There were very effective social controls. For example, I lived with a tribe in the Amazon called Cubeos who used coca leaf. And coca was prepared every day and made available to everyone in the tribe, but kids didn't use it. And I asked every kid I could in the tribe that I could find questions like, "Don't you want to try coca?" They would say, "No." "Aren't you interested in how it makes you feel?" "No." "Don't you want to know how it makes your dad feel when you?" "No, I'll wait till I grow up." I never hear kids in our culture say things like that. You know, and this was in a culture where there were no external controls, it was not illegal. This was a social consensus that everybody bought into. I think that is a really effective way of dealing with all this.
Andrew Weil. Plants of power can harm or heal, kill or cure as they are used or abused. They hold the keys to the locks of our minds. They can open the gates of heaven to sacred ecstasy, or open the gates of hell to addiction, degradation, and death. In The Doors of Perception, his 1954 account of taking mescaline, derived from peyote, the author Aldous Huxley was astonished by the sacramental vision of reality that he was granted. And in all the horror and hysteria around the word drugs today, we should not forget that ancient transcendental instinct at the core of the experience. For a shared moment, creatures of biology, like this woman invoking an Amazonian plant of power, Mother Ayahuasca, reconnect to the universe and to the source of all our life, the sun.
Madre Ayahuasca, llévame hacia el sol.